12 miles below. By Mark Arrows. Chapter 161 to 170. Book 4, Chapter 21, The Temple. Travel underground ended up being categorized by 3 speeds. The first was a walking caravan. Slowest, easiest to attack, the tool of the desperate, but nobody could argue with the sheer carrying capacity if they had prepared ahead of time for the journey. The second speed were relic knights, or just soldiers as the undersiders called them. They'd sprint for quite some time but could only carry a limited amount. Usually they ran with a hand on a hover sled that carried the important things like people or ammo, and whatever could fit in their sacks. The third speed was for military and nobility use, which involved renting out air speeders. Undersider versions had no external handholds and were smaller than their surface counterparts. They could go very quickly, but only among wide enough roads and stretches. At night speed, the temple was expected to be 3 days of travel. The clan knights sprinted the entire way, pausing only to consume ration bars when needed and only for a few minutes to rest the mind and return to sprinting. The Winter Blossom technique eliminated even the small fatigue of moving in armor that regular knights had to deal with. It was, after all, only the armor moving. At first, the entire clan moved as a unit, since the general direction matched up with the surface recovery point. Day 1 passed and the group split with only a few words of goodbye. And now only the dedicated remained, racing against time directly to the Might Forge. The flooded temple of Ordritz wasn't named for some lost god or people. A hunter team stumbled on this while on expedition to map the surrounding areas during the days the Undersiders were deciding on settling here or in a few other locations of known pillars. The scoutmaster was named Ordritz, and his team had discovered a lot of landmarks along the way. However, his massive ego wouldn't put his name on anything that wasn't impressive enough. The temple counted, and that ended up being the only thing Ordritz put his personal name on. Interesting fellow. And it did not bode well for the size of this temple. First sign we'd come close to our target was the water. We loped down a mountainside path, easily clearing the rocks with vaults and precise jumps before landing into a puddle that just never ended. It looked like Caprinor's lake, except shallow enough to reach only our boot soles, and we couldn't see the other end of the shoreline, if it even existed. Further past the initial empty stretch of water were trees. Not bunched up, but close enough to slowly obscure any vision through them. They all grew in this pseudo-lake, bright teal and green leaves. The clan knights dove right into the forest, weaving expertly between the wide trees and leaving only ripples extending out on the otherwise mostly still water. Somewhere at the center of this forest, we'd find the temple. Think we made it before Suffocate could show up? I asked over the soul link I had to Wrath. It hadn't taken any effort to keep another tendril of soul linked up to her own fractal, so long as she was close enough to me. And the sack I used to ferry her on my back was close enough. Feathers can be rebuilt anywhere in the world. They use a teleportation network in the lower stratus to then move closer to where they need to be. The final mile will need to be traveled on foot, however feathers will be faster than you are. What's the time frame we're working with? Wrath hummed in thought. At best, Suffocate decided to take her time and wait in line for the next available forge. Then, when she travels up to the city, she'll discover it empty. Only then will she suspect and possibly come here. That would give us perhaps a week at most. Maybe this expedition wasn't quite as doomed as Lord Atius had made it out to be. We could be in and out of the temple within hours. The worst we could run into was whatever machines had already made it their home, and against us they wouldn't stand a chance. So long as we remained hidden on the way back up, Suffocate wouldn't be able to tell where we are. The unity fractal that connected all machines could only connect to the soul fractal, of which wouldn't give much information at all other than the immediate surroundings, if even that. Machines didn't have a soul sight, they needed a wired connection to any kind of sensor. The feathers would know she's alive, but so long as she didn't allow any intruder further access into her systems, there was nothing they could do to locate her. What about the worst case? The worst possible situation I can calculate is that Suffocate already knew of my allegiances before she arrived to the city. I find this unlikely, as Suffocate would have used a surprise attack directly to neutralize my shell before I could react. Instead, she allowed me to get close enough to speak. Counterpoint, she's a feather. They like to gloat. Maybe she was doing some kind of ego thing, where she went ahead of her team just to kill you early. Wrath stayed silent for a moment before she gave a resigned sight. I admit that maybe be a possibility. My kind are prone to certain vices. So if she was doing it all to toy with you, what's next? Suffocate would not have expected to have been defeated. I would imagine she would spend everything she's accumulated in order to pass the line and recreate her body at the first available spot and then rush directly to the city. I calculate 6 to 8 hours before suffocate is within range. She would first search for my shell, find it missing and assume it would have been brought back to the city. No way Zong could evacuate an entire city that fast, even if they had been preparing for it. They're not nearly that ready. Wrath gave a sad nod inside her digital world. Indeed. Suffocate would find the migrants and likely attack them. She would hunt down the general, or any other high-ranking officer and obtain information on us from there. If this is the case, we can expect her to appear behind us at some point, likely after we've entered the temple. It is possible we could have my shell fixed enough to leave early, before she arrives. So we had good chances even in the worst-case situation to beat the feather to the might forge. Kathita chimed in, oblivious to our private conversation. Temples in range, young man. Chin up, sword out, and do us proud now. She said. The mix of having the Empire vindicated as real in addition to seeing Wrath absolutely trashed had made the Crusader quite happy for the old bat. She hadn't even insulted me all day so far. The moment we passed the Trilene, the group of knights came to a stop. Partly from natural shock, and partly from Lord Atias's call on the comms. Ahead of us was another long empty stretch of shallow water. And at the center stood what looked like a small city, complete with white walls. All across the ground were pillars with decorative ends, most of which had been broken down with chunks spread across the water ground. The temple itself was one massive building, interconnected with sloping arches, bridges, and grand statues that look vaguely humanoid. At the very entrance was a set of stairs that must have reached 3 or 4 stories high before the actual entrance. Looked more like a city made for giants than humans. Lord Atias's voice crackled over the comms. All of you lads should have read the packet General Zong provided us a few dozen times now over the trip here. The temple has multiple floors to it, no doors or sealed chambers anywhere. The main floor will be flooded in at boot level like here. The subfloor under it has more pronounced flooding, up to chest level, and that's where the Might Forge will be located. We'll travel above on the roof level to avoid being slowed down and make our way to the second floor once we've come close enough to the Might Forge. Expected enemies will be spiders, screamers, locust, and serpents. Advance. We got about 20 steps forward before Father broke his silent mediation, yelling over the comms system from the Medallion Kedra War. Leap up, now. Clan knights, having been trained from infancy to follow orders from a superior, didn't question Father's orders and leapt up high in the air. Even our deathless didn't take the warning lightly. It saved our lives. Not even a moment into the air, 17 beams of bright blue slammed all across the area we'd just been at, living only for a fraction of a second, cutting into the water and right into the rock under it. A shockwave and steam raced out a moment after, the entire world engulfed in chaos and white blinding mist. Journey instantly compensated for that, highlighting objects on the HUD right through the steam including where the ground was, rock outlines and outlines of all knights with us. On the list of names in the group, 3 had turned orange from their usual green. Suffocate had beat us to the temple. Worse, she'd been waiting for us to walk out into the open. Fall back behind Trilene, now. Atias commanded over the comms. Journey instantly highlighted a waypoint, showing me which way to run through the fog. A1, dive. Father yelled, and a moment later the chaos returned. Beams of blue lanced through the mist, casting them away like an exorcist cutting through a miasma. They weren't aimed, hitting the ground instead of any target. One came close to a knight and the shockwave threw him off his feet. Shields flared up on the armor before another hiss of steam hit everything. 2 names on my HUD turned grey instantly. 1 turned flashing red. We were getting cut apart. N2, 401 on A1 Windrunner spoke over the comms, keeping a level voice. R1, 401 on N1. Leave H1 behind. In my HUD I could see 2 knight outlines break formation. One rushed to grab red flashing outlines of a fallen knight, lifting them up and continuing the mad sprint back to the Trilene. Another did the same, running straight for a limp grey outline. I didn't see the rest, already passing right by. A second later, our group sprinted out of the steam clouds like wraiths, vaporized water trailing behind the gust of wind we each left behind. Another volley of beams sounded behind us, but we were too far out and those beams had been aimed at the cloud center. Trees started to blur past, and soon we were back in the deep forest, taking a steep left as a group and circling around to a more unpredictable location. All units, combat confirmed. Apply Propranolol version 7, call out status. Casualties first. Atius ordered, looking over the group. The knights all nodded, sounds of medical kits clicking open as each took out a cylinder inside, some already lifting it up to their necks and applying the drug. N1, leg cut off. One of the knights said, letting go of another who'd carried him this far. He wasn't mincing his words either. The leg had been chopped off, armor and all, at an angle starting from his knee. There wasn't any blood, the wound was blackened. A1, Kos. Another knight said, putting down a body he'd carried. This one was missing everything under his chest plate. Just a pair of arms with a limp helmet. His was one of the names grayed out on my HUD. Verify the soul fractal on the side of his helmet. Father's voice crackled from his medallion. The knight who'd carried his fellow paused in his own medical application, then swiftly turned his helmet down to the dead body. In a moment, he was kneeling, drawing his helmet close enough to touch. He's alive. The knight shouted, his soul is in the fractal, he can't return to his body, but reports status nominal otherwise. There was a kind of wonder in his voice. The rest of the knights paused, implications settling on their shoulders. I had hoped not to test this theory out anytime soon, Tenny sent, for obvious reasons. Atius said with a sigh, gravel in his voice. Fortune smiles on us this time it seems. Cut free his soul fractal and hand it to Lady Winterscar. Tenny sent, we'll leave A1 to your care. All units, keep focused on the mission, do not assume complete immortality. The clan knights nodded. There hadn't been a change in posture, but there was a feeling of relief. As if the mission was no longer as oppressive as it had been during the run here, even if technically it had gone even worse than the worst possible case. Lord, does that mean H1 is also possibly alive? Another knight from the A group asked, the grey name of his teammate morbidly just under on the list of names. Atius nodded. Most likely yes, so long as his helmet was not destroyed. We can't afford to grab his body just yet, he can wait until we've cleared out the threats. Old eyes turned to the group. I am not in the habit of leaving warriors behind. We'll recover him the moment we can, or plan out a future mission to do so in stealth. Tennyson's experience as a soul shows they can remain alive and in slumber for months. He pointed to 8 knights, split into groups of 2 and scout ahead. We need to discover if the machines are attempting a surround or if they've sent forces after us. They gave a salute, and 4 scout parties instantly raced out, fading into the trees. Windrunner walked over to Atius's side. Plan. Tisefit has already made a nest within the temple, likely at the high ground for full visibility. We should assume the other 2 feathers are also within the temple guarding her. Plan needs confirmation first on viability. He turned to me, or rather to Wrath that was secured on my back. Is there any way for Keith to fix you himself on the surface? We could retreat back. Even if it took months, it would be the safest compared to continuing on. Wrath spoke over Journey's speakers. Keith could repair the majority of my shell systems with my guidance over enough time. She said. The control nodes for the nanoswarms could be fixed by hand, however the central command systems that could activate those swarms isn't something that can be fixed conventionally. Neuromorphic and smaller chips within my head were not built to be operated on by anything other than nanoswarms, his armor couldn't hold his hands steady enough to repair damage there. Atius nodded, looking grim. Deadlock then. Is another Might Forge viable? No. Travel time to another Might Forge would give the feathers more access to resources, we would run into a far larger army each time we turned to search for a new forge. And they would still reach the location before we do. I see. He said, looking back in the direction of the temple. So this is them at their weakest. They'll only grow stronger from here on out. If we can't win now, we can never win later. How'd she even beat us here? I asked. Worst case, she's supposed to be interrogating some of the Undersiders and then leaving them immediately to come chase behind us. She should be attacking from the forest instead of on top of the temple. She must have moved directly to the temple instead of searching for my shell near the city. Wrath said. It is the only possible way. I do not know how she knew we would come here of all places. My machines do not broadcast any relevant information back to the machine archive. Is a full frontal charge using a scattered formation possible? Windrunner asked, already moving past the Wise. The open terrain before the temple would take only half a minute at a full sprint to reach. It's possible the majority of our forces can reach the temple without being eliminated. Atius shook his head. If we can't find another way, that'll be our last resort. Wrath's report on Tisefit showed the beams came from hovering plates around her. She could aim those freely. Even split into groups, to suffocate could fire on all of us at the same time. Catheta cut into my helmet while the group was discussing possible strategies. You haven't taken the shot. She hissed. That drug existed even back in my day, don't think I don't know what it's for. Take the booster, or I'll rat you out. I could mute you. I said, hand over the medical kit to my side. You can't mute a text message, brat. I'll send it faster than you can blink through the menu. Try me. The medkit unhooked from my belt with little resistance. Inside were cylinders, all marked differently. Knights had a different set than scavengers used. My old one had large handles to manipulate through thick gloves, and a needle point to punch through. We also had a field repair kit right next to the vials so we could seal the hole made. This kit was different, the fat vials made to hook up to a socket on the side of the throat. The armor would allow it through. I picked the right vial and started to give it a few turns, a measuring needle on the side moving with each twist. I think I've got an idea on how to sneak into the temple, I said to the crusader while working out the dosage. Pretend to be a walking tree or something. Catheta scoffed. The mission's a bust. Give up on the minx and just go back home safe. No need to stick your leg out for a glorified calculator with a pretty face. That's so? Then you're going to love this next part. We just so happen to have a guide following around us somewhere, haunting the place. Time I put him to work. Book 4, Chapter 22, Sneak Level 10. When the propranolol dissociation passed, I flicked my HUD settings and found a recently used channel number. I had a mission to annoy a very specific machine, and I'm very good at what I do. Are you sure you want to go this route, dearie? Catheta asked. Machines can't be trusted. They're servants of evil, silver-tongued devils, the lot of them. Atius and the Knights are already coming up with any plan I could, I'm picking options that only I'd know about. Now, switch over to the last band he used, short range, wide spectrum with the same encryption he used. She gave an exasperated sigh. Fine. But don't come crying to me when he leads you into a trap. Journey complied, connecting all the comm settings to the correct values. You're live. Knock yourself out. So, mysterious voice. Think Wrath and I could use some of that mysterious wisdom of yours right about now. No response came. Catheta huffed. The toaster split, knew he was a coward like the rest of his ilk. I could smell it. You can't smell. You're a digital engram. I reminded Catheta, again. Then switched back to the wideband, trying to bait out the wraith again. If you don't, we might end up having to storm the temple the traditional way. Tisefit's probably got good eyes. She'll spot me running with a sack behind, and laser me first. Best I could do is slap a sign on my sack saying spare parts, don't worry about it. I give it maybe between 0 to 0% chance of working. Still no answer. What are you going to tell your mite friends when Wrath's not available to do her job because she's been blown to bits? Better yet, without me, who's going to recover that artifact I buried upstairs? The one with all the traps that you don't want to deal with. There was a click, followed by static. A signal was being sent back. You are insufferable. A robotic voice responded on the comms. Got him. Catheta groaned. Why do you always have to work with goddess-damned machines of all things? Every time I blink there's a new goddess-forsaken one you've picked up somehow. Are you cursed or something? Enemy of my enemy is probably my friend. I said, then went back to hunting for the wraith hiding somewhere in the forest. You know, mysterious voice filled with static is a bit of a mouthful, got a nickname. There was a hiss of static. Quit being shy, we'll be stuck with each other for some time going forward, you might as well give me something to work with here. I'll come up with a really great name if you don't. Abraxas. The voice answered, as if being dragged through broken glass. Probably not too far from the truth. That sounds like an oddly normal name. I said. For a toaster. Catheta added. I pick name. Meaning is mine. Not for you. Abraxas answered back, sounding upset. Shall I start to triangulate his position? Catheta asked privately and nearly gave me a heart attack. I made sure to shut down all of that through the HUD as soon as it popped up. You just want to spook him to go away with that. No tracing. Get the feeling he's the paranoid type. An invisible machine hiding away from all the other machines, the paranoid type. Catheta drooled. You don't say. All right then, Abraxas. Are you familiar with this temple? Better move on before Cathita could sabotage me more openly. There was a strong temptation to mute her, but we were in combat right now even if it was a lull. I'd need her intuition and skills at any moment, and there was still a chance she had something useful to say about this. A low chance. Am familiar. Abraxas said. Passed through twice. Hostile environment both times. There was hope in this plan after all. Can you guide us into this temple, preferably without that feather shooting us? He stayed quiet. I considered asking again, and was interrupted right as I opened my mouth. Can say. But must remain hidden. From feather in sack. And from allies behind you. Deal cannot be broken. Going to be a little tough to explain to everyone here that I know something I shouldn't know, and don't want to tell them why or how. Your problem. Not mine. Abraxas said. Do we have deal? Fine you little scamp. Keep lurking around, I'll make sure only my armor and I know you're here. Not like I had much choice on that. Abraxas knew a way in, and I needed to get in, before the rest of the machines arrived. Simple addition here. I could still sneak his existence to the clan knights over private encrypted comms, however I had a strong feeling I'd be working with Abraxas in the future. He was supposed to guide Wrath somewhere, and I don't think this temple was the original job description he'd signed up for. If I broke his agreements this early, he'd understandably be a little more hesitant to help me out again. Temple mirrored. The machine said after I'd solemnly sworn secrecy. Not horizontally. Vertically. Matches as above. Roof of strata under. Upside down temple. That's an interesting bit of trivia. If it was mirrored on the roof of the strata under us, it's probably for a reason. Otherwise I'd have seen more might pseudo-cities crawl up the walls and hang upside down before. Serves as some kind of gateway to the next level down. I guessed right. Yes. Gravity different, under temple. Float down. One way. No return back up. Abraxas confirmed. Not used often. Better, more open routes to lower strata exist. Ways that work back and back. And according to Undersider maps Zong had graciously given, under us was some kind of desert with storm events happening low to the ground. I reviewed the video logs of our brief and painful combat encounter. The temple sat squat ahead of the group, stupidly large but also a little on the flat side. I can see it doesn't get many tourists, sure. I said, zooming in further on the recording to a bell tower. Seemed to be the highest place. Exactly as expected, there was a fuzzy figure perched on top. A few flashes of blue and then Father's call to jump came right after. Look at the devil, and we heard her voice. Magnified across the distance, loud enough to reach even the forest we were hiding in. The clan knights all froze in place, keeping still as if she could hear us. It seems I missed. She said, sounding vexed. Would you all kindly do me the service of returning here so I can fix that mistake? She think we're going to answer her? Windrunner asked, sounding amused. None of us are that stupid. I pointedly did not notice Kedra turning her helmet to stare in my direction. All feathers enjoy boasting. Lord Atias said. Leave her to speak and focus on our current objective. Don't mute her, the devil could spill something we might use. Tesefit's initial barrage had been massive, racking across our entire group. If Father hadn't called out, she'd have flat out erased us out of existence before we even knew the fight started. Straight ruthless. Good thing we could cheat with Father's death perception. She must be a bit miffed about that. The attack did show the difference between Duekar and Tesefit. The old toaster would have waited for us to get to the stairs where he'd be able to have the most dramatic monologue before trying to cut us up in the most flashy way possible. Tesefit had not given even so much as a warning. She wanted us dead and she'd opened fire with her strongest hitters right out the gate. Wrath said she'd fired 3 beams with each volley. Here, she'd opened fire with 17 and then constantly continued the barrage afterwards. Had to wonder what the other feathers on her team were like if she was like this. There were 2 others, though it wasn't guaranteed they were waiting inside the temple. Come now humans, don't be so coy. Tesefit's voice echoed. It's poor manners to leave a lady waiting. Besides, you'll all have to come scurrying out at some point. More lessers will arrive here soon enough. They'll swarm the forest from outside in, and then what will you do, I wonder? Atias hummed. She's attempting to pressure us into action faster. Curious. The other clan knights said nothing, the 4 scout teams returning with reports and terrain data. They'd done a full sweep, all around the temple. There was that stretch of empty water at every angle, though some places had a smaller distance to cover. No machines had been discovered, and neither had any left from the temple grounds. She has limited forces to work with, Atias concluded from their report. Sending out waves of screamers after us would reveal our location once we engaged and eliminated them, however we'd moved too fast in relocating elsewhere for her to capitalize. His logic made some twisted kind of sense. If Tisefit had unlimited machines to throw away, she'd have done so and shot wherever the casualty reports returned, on the off chance of hitting us. Low chances, but there's always a chance she'll blindly hit close enough. If she hadn't done that, it meant she couldn't afford the cost. Or she'd been ordered to conserve forces. Best plan they were coming up with was to divide in several groups, surround the temple, and attempt to distract Tisefit long enough for a force to reach the perimeter of the temple. A few knights with longer-ranged ordnance would open fire on her plates, with hope that they weren't shielded. Tisefit would have to not only track multiple evading targets rushing from every direction, she'd need to do it while moving her plates out of the way of the covering fire. How deep is the ground here before we hit the roof of the next strata down? I asked Abraxas while the clan plotted the best way to dodge hits. 30 feet. The old robot said. Then, other side is reached. And if the temple is mirrored and made for people to walk down to the next strata, then there's a midsection squashed between. You catch on? Abraxas said. Layer underground. Like roots of tree. Passage. General Zong couldn't have found the passage. In effect, neither had Ordritz clearly. The winding maze-like temple with hundreds of grand roofless rooms and plazas had been too large for him and his team to explore all of it before the machines started getting upset at the visitors. Might forges tended to have vast amounts of machines lurking around. Only reason the temple wasn't overrun with machines was due to there being no human cities within reach at that point. Once humans settle in, machines start to make sure the nearby might forges aren't ever available. Ordritz found the might forge at the center of the temple, documented a few different spots with pictures and waypoints on their exploration, and then had to beat it back home. Future expeditions to get things from the might forge opened up more discoveries, but machines were always constant and only grew once the city started to grow. Telling the clan I'd found out there was some kind of underground passage was a little less awkward than expected. They'd trusted I had sources of some kind, and also understood when I said I couldn't divulge where I'd gotten them. To clan knights, if someone said their information was need to know only, they shrugged metaphorical shoulders and asked no further questions, trusting their superior to have their reasons. Lord Atias could have ordered me to give the info, however he hadn't. I think he understood implicitly when I said I couldn't break some bridges right now. With Abraxas's knowledge, the clan's plan shifted. We'd keep a smaller team among the trees that would open fire on Tisefit and keep her entertained. The larger team would sneak through the roots of the temple and breach from there. The moment we ran into machines, we'd be alerting Tisefit that we'd gotten in, so it was important to keep hidden as long as we could and let her think we were still lurking around in the trees. Ideally, we'd get to the might forge, have it fixed just Wrath's head, and then sneak back without the feather knowing. Is this one of the openings? I asked Abraxas, with the clan knights following behind. Ahead was a larger tree and it matched the signs the machine had told me to look for. Specifically a radiating pattern of the leaves outwards. It would be hard to spot unless standing under it. This is one opening. Abraxas answered. Throw rock at tree trunk. I had questions, but we had a time limit hovering on our heads. Without complaint, I reached down, yanked a loose rock from underwater, and lobbed it at the tree. It hit, bounced up and off. Nothing else happened. Atias turned his attention at that, an eyebrow raising up, as if he recognized something more meaningful in throwing rocks at a tree. Aim higher. The machine said. I'd gotten practice throwing rocks at FIDO before, so this felt nostalgic in a way. The next rock sailed forward and didn't hit the tree at all. Instead it just sunk right through, as if passing through air. The tree surface rippled for a moment, as if a reflection of water, before it popped like a bubble of soap. Behind it was a large tree hollow, with enough space for 2 knights to wiggle into. Everyone except for Atias seemed outright caught off guard. He just nodded along, as if recognizing this blizzard thing. A might illusion. We'd all turned to silently ask what the hell, so he'd answered. I've seen this in the lower levels, though never this far up. Odd of them to do something like this. Mites can make illusions. I asked, while other clan knights got closer to the tree, poking it from different directions to see if more parts of it could pop. They can. They're bastards about it too. Often making the obvious ways long and difficult, while hiding a faster and cleaner route. Any physical disturbance will break the illusion for an hour or so before it regenerates. Some deathless grow so paranoid of this, they flare out the occult periodically, trying to tap every wall and flat surface at least once. Just to see if there's some kind of hidden room. A pair of knights were dispatched to begin scouting the tree hollow. There wasn't any kind of ladder inside, though the wooden handholds that dotted the inside of the tree were far from natural. Hollow leads to an underground tunnel of some kind. No light, no hostiles detected. Slight current of water by our feet, flowing one direction. The report came back. There. Way in. Abraxas said. Do not call again. Fix feather, leave. Do not take long. Love you too, buddy. I said as the comms connection closed. We had a way into the temple and we had our distraction team set up and ready to harass Suffocate. No idea what waited us inside the temple, or where the other two reported feathers were. Best odds we could come up with on short notice. It'll have to do. Book 4, Chapter 23, Sneak Level 100. I'm worried about this plan. Wrath said through the soul link, head half buried in the sack. Single working eye watched as the clan knights worked to pass off equipment and gear off the hover sleds. I recalled all forces in the area, including those within this temple. They have lived here for years, it's likely they've already learned all passages over that time. The new forces called by Suffocate here may have gotten that information. You could be walking into a trap. You didn't know about it. I countered. And you're their boss. I didn't need to know smaller details like this. I am not omniscient. They may have not known about these tunnels either, if it were hidden well enough. All right, fair point. I thought. What's the chances that the machines inside had enough time to scout out all the tunnels? I am not sure. It depends on how obvious the entrances are. If the tunnels lead into secret doorways, then it is fairly likely Suffocate forces have not discovered them within the few hours since. Even if it's a trap of some kind, we've got to take it. Up here, Suffocate will give us no chance at all to make it inside. Down there, could be anyone's guess. Long-range munitions and rifles were passed over from clan knights to the Shadow Songs, both the minions and their fearless leader. Lord Atius had made a good point about leaving them up here with a few of the clan knights, and the one with a wounded leg. Perhaps on the surface we might find another method of repairing my circuits. Wrath said. Suya may have a possible solution. This might be the last chance we've got to access a might forge. After this they'll be looking for you anywhere you show your face. So long as you have the Unity Fractal, Relinquished will know you're still alive somewhere. Wrath said nothing to that, sulking further into the sack. I could tell she wasn't comfortable being so dependent on others. This hadn't been something she'd ever needed to go through. Outside of the temple, the worst enemies the knights could fight would be machines in open ground. Other than drakes, the knights could hold almost indefinitely against any enemy given the Winter Blossom technique along with their training both inside and outside the digital sea. So leaving the Shadow Songs up here had made good sense. Inside the temple, experience would be king. When Anka had begun to protest on claim of being handled too lightly, Windrunner pointed a hand right in the direction of the temple, slightly up. Suffocate. While we were preparing to dive into Feather Central, there was still a good chance only Suffocate had managed to make it here in time. We might not run into anything at all, fix up Wrath and get out just as quick. I mean, I absolutely didn't believe that was going to happen, I'm not an idiot. But it was theoretically possible all of this worked out exactly according to plan. In the same way it was theoretically possible that the sun stopped rising at dawn given a large enough calamity. Anyhow, as far as I knew, Anka wasn't going to have it easy even if it seemed like the safer group to be part of. The home team up there would need to keep shooting, from range, at a target that believed artillery spam was a noble strategy. If anything they'd need to be the most nimble between our two groups. I could already see them strapping the legless knight on one of the hover sleds, planning out the logistics of being able to alternate fire from different sites and run like hell after every shot. The away team ended up being 5 of Atius's knights including Windrunner, 5 Winterscar knights including Captain Sagrius, then Kedra, Atius, and I to wrap up the team. 13 all in all, filing down the hidden hollow into the tunnel under us. We landed with a slash, the walls down here wet with mist, illuminated in small teal lights. A pair of knights waited for us at the bottom, rifles aiming down range. No signs of movement. Path seems clear, Lord. Atius nodded, giving a critical glance into the murky depths ahead. Time's fading fast. Let's get to it. Home team, engage to suffocate the moment she shows signs of moving. Away team, advance. The knights began to march forward, weapons scanning across each pathway. The small stream at the bottom of our feet rushed forward in a clear direction, likely towards the temple. We followed as silently as 13 soldiers could creep, which turned out to be quieter than thought. 2 clan knights and Zagreus took point, trailed behind by the rest of the group. Holding our rear were the Winterscar knights, kept in reserve to hold off a flanking attack. We passed the first antechamber, a larger cavern filled with different tunnels streaming out. At the center a larger puddle where the streams intersected, flooding forward to a larger tunnel ahead. The room was filled with familiar metal stakes. A nest. Wrath said, though the team here clearly recognized the signs, rifles pointing up to search for possible targets. We found nothing, only past signs of occupation. These sisters were recalled to the city. None took over their territory since. This is a good sign that Tesepht's forces haven't had enough time to explore the temple. Further proof she's simply low on the number of machines to throw at us. I thought. With the only spider in the room strapped on my back and harmless enough, the group flowed through the tunnel, advancing forward into the larger tunnel. Soon the walls stopped looking like rock and more like actual temple walls. The HUD on my map showed we'd crossed past the field of water above. Tesepht was either being bullied by the surface team or hadn't yet caught on that the majority of the knights were sneaking under her nose. So far so good. Up until it wasn't. We turned a corner and slid to a stop. At the end of this corridor was the clear light of the Might Temple. Light bright enough to mimic sunlight. A broken room filled with pillars crumpled on one another, half submerged in crystal blue water, large white walls stacked like fallen dominoes against each other, or broken into smaller piles. Green leaves growing in the few places where dirt had piled up, adding a splash of life to the otherwise pristine ruins. That wasn't what took our attention. Ahead at the end of the corridor leading to the outside stood a mountain of alabaster white muscle, interspersed with black lines all across his body in geometric patterns. Small twinkles of violet lights within immediately showed none of this was organic. A massive warhammer that matched his size rested casually on his right shoulder, while a wall of bronze waited in his other. The tower shield looked more like a cut-apart doorway, with some kind of ornate painting across the surface depicting a tree. The rest of the details were cut from the rough edges of the shield. Crude. And completely at odds with the rest of his aesthetic. The massive man's face was half hidden with a headscarf sloppily held, dropping over one eye and wrapping around his throat. The other glowing violet eye seemed filled with nothing but apathy as it lazily turned to meet us. I'd never seen a feather look more like a hunched muscle-head minion before, but here he was. Almost within the same moment he'd appeared, his body lit up in bright yellow sparks all across as the clan knights opened fire from rifles without hesitation. None of it did anything to a feather, of course. Reflex and training was the error here. They'd been too conditioned to respond to threats using rifles, when they should have opened fire with a nightbreaker instead. Atius rightfully called out for a shot the very next moment, the knight at the front responding by tossing his own rifle aside with little care, reaching to the back of his hip for the grenade launcher. Every knight here had one round ready to go, carefully carried from the few we had to work with. They'd been brought down here to kill a feather, only fitting they end up doing exactly that, if not the exact original target. And the muscle-head grunted, unbothered by the spray of bullets impacting his body at all points. He lifted the warhammer, rolled his shoulders, and slammed the weapon straight down into the stone ahead of him. When the head of the hammer struck the ground, nothing physical happened anywhere. There was no impact. No crater in the ground. No damage at all even. Instead, a cold light raced ahead of him, filling the hallway with light across the walls and ground, straight at us. One heartbeat and it was already past us, leaving the corridor filled with crackles of blue-tinted lighting. Gravity fled with it. The knights and I started to float up, desperate scrabbling around only caused us to bounce off each other. The one with the nightbreaker kept a hold, aiming downside even as he floated off his feet. Ropes! Windrunner yelled out over comms, right behind me. Get us out of here, now! The Winterscar knights behind us had been guarding our backs, and they hadn't yet turned the corridor. From my peripheral, I saw they hadn't been affected. Looked like the occult couldn't turn corners, the anti-gravity field had been a straight line. My house knights instantly holstered weapons, drawing out grappling ropes with hooks, and threw them into the anti-gravity field, where knights behind me grabbed hold and were pulled out. I got my hands on a rope hook, then reached out to Kedra floating above me, grabbing her dress and yanking her to the rope. She grabbed on just above me. The feather wasn't done. He lifted the bronze shield and dropped it before him. He'd lifted it like it weighed a few pounds, but when it dropped, the ground cracked under. That thing was heavy. A cold pulsed again, and this time gravity returned, except directly at him. Down became sideways, and all of us fell directly in his direction. Those of us who'd already grabbed ropes had a chance to hold on, the string growing taut as the full weight of several relic armors held down against it. With the rope swinging us now, most of us slammed into the side of the wall, feet taking footholds. 2 knights and Captain Sagrius up front hadn't been so lucky. They'd been too far from the ropes. The lead knight hadn't even tried to attach himself, too busy aiming the Nightbreaker in that short span of time. He'd been quick, his entire movement had only taken seconds. But so had the feather's own movements. The bronze shield ahead continued to draw the free-falling knights. The Nightbreaker round fired out. Even in this close range, it still had time to activate the rocket propellant. The round roared to life, screaming straight into the bronze shield, impacting it. Occult chains flared out the sides and wrapped around the tower shield. They connected and then bounced off, repelled. No shields or any kind appeared, the material seemed to be outright impervious. In moments, the Nightbreaker shell also crushed itself flat against the shield, breaking the chains and cutting off power. The shield remained untouched. The round had hit it with the same impact of a fly against a fly swatter. The feather lifted a foot, and caught the spent shell as it rolled past him, stomping it into the ground like a paperclip. The lead knight tossed the spent grenade launcher to the side, already drawing out his blade as he fell directly at the shield. The other 2 flanking him had also reoriented themselves in the fall, blades equally ready to strike. Strange gravity was nothing to them. They'd trained in the digital sea where gravity existed at odd angles. To them, this was simply a jump from up high on an enemy under them. The feather brought his hammer up again, and swiped it across the closest knight before he'd reached the shield. The hit struck the unfortunate knight, carried him down with the swing, into the ground. This time, when the hammer hit ground, it did exactly as a hammer ought to do when swung with superhuman strength. The entire ground collapsed under, ripping apart as a cold pulsed across the hammer. The knight was utterly flattened into the ground, armored shield coming online to hold against the onslaught. The shield held against whatever occult spell the feather had used in his hammer, but the humans inside hadn't. Green nameplate instantly turned grey. Medical scans showed inertia had squashed the fragile grey matter against the inside of his skull. NNNN1. The feather said as the knight's limp armor began to fall out of the crater, pulled by the artificial gravity. He let go of the tower shield handle and slammed the freed hand to the side of the wall. A cold rushed through the white arm, outlining an imprint of his hand in glowing blue. Air began to whoosh through the room, being sucked towards the handprint. The feather took a casual step back, dragging the stupidly huge shield with him, as the next knight slammed down against it, feet first. He scrambled to leap over the barrier and stab at the mountain of muscle hiding behind. That moment didn't come. Even with the relic armor's power clawing at the shield, the grip slacked and slipped off as the knight plummeted directly into the wall where the handprint lay, as if sucked to an airlock. Shields triggered from the heavy impact, but nothing near close enough to deal internal damage. The knight was safe. The feather's hammer swung down on him before he could even roll, the flat head glowing bright occult blue. Another nameplate turned grey on my HUD as the rock walls shook from the impact. Too many bones had been fractured, internal organs ripped apart from the sharp shards, the whole body acting more like jelly trapped inside armor, whipped around by mutated physics. 2. The feather grunted, lifting the hammer off the wall, the dead knight sliding off the crater and down the hallway, body limp. A violet eye turned past the bronze tower shield to stare up at Sagrius. Looking for a third victim. The captain had the sense to angle his fall against the floor of the hallway, an occult blade slashing a wide cut into the ground, while his other hand drew out his personal rope and hook, slamming it into the freshly cut ground. His speed instantly cut off, the relic armor more than strong enough against the inverted gravity. I spun out my own rope and hook from my belt, launching it directly at him, calling out for him to grab hold so I could lift him to safety. NNNN. Annoying. The feather growled, then leaped forward through the corridor, unaffected by the modified gravity or the bullets pinging off his skin sent down by desperate knights. The hammer swung down for the captain, bloodthirsty for a third soul to add to his tally. Book 4, Chapter 24, Tried. Incoming! I screamed out, praying he'd grab the rope fast enough for me to yank him out of range. Zagreus realized there was no time for that. Instead, he twisted on himself and lifted a hand directly to the incoming hammer while bracing his shoulder against the floor. Two shimmering occult domes appeared, one on his hand and the other on the other ends against his braced shoulder. The hammer struck an instant later, and held against the barrier in a shockwave of dust and electric occult. Zagreus grunted, hand straining backwards. The force passed straight through, as if channeled from his hand and out this shoulder, the ground under him cracking further, the hook bumped out with the broken rock. Inverted gravity already started to make it fall while Zagreus remained pinned between the floor and the hammer, occult crackling around him. NNNN. Deathless. The feather murmured, violet eye widening slightly. Tedious. The hammer glowed brighter and pulsed out with force. The ground under the captain ripped apart in dust and pulverized stone. His occult spell shattered against the pulse, but so had the hammer been repelled backwards in the explosion. Zagreus slumped, exhausted for a half-second. Then, he mustered enough energy to twist to the side and kick off the closest wall, the feather's hammer returning for a second attack, striking his abandoned hook, flattening it like a paperclip. The captain hadn't made a clean escape. His ankle and foot had been just slightly in the way. His armor's shields triggered, holding off the hammer just long enough for him slip past. Not long enough for the glow of the hammer to disperse downwards, occult twisting force and physics behind the blow. His name tag turned orange, medical report showing shattered bones in his foot and massive muscle contusions within. He didn't let that get in his way. The fake gravity sent him sliding him along the floor behind the hammer's swing. Behind the tower shield. A kick on the side of the walls let him slip past the feather's own lazy attempt to stomp down on the passing knight. His occult blade whipped through the air at lightning fast speed at the same time. It struck the feather's body and exposed leg, triggering shields. 2 hits, 3 hits, 4 hits. The captain continued to slide down the corridor, delivering one final hit before the gravity threw him out of range. Soon enough, he reached the end of the artificial gravity, then rolled back up on 2 feet by the battered remains of the other 2 clan knights. The feather regarded him for a moment, shrugged, then turned back to face us as if he was no threat. "Orders, Lord." The captain called out, breathing heavily. "Winterscar, hold position, lad," Atius answered calmly, assessing the situation. "We'll slip another few knights in your direction and then open fire with night breakers on both sides. His shield can only hold off one direction." Howling came from the end of the corridor, where Zagreus stood. He turned his helmet to search behind him, then drew his swords in that direction. A moment later, he leaped out of view, and white blurs raced past where he'd been. The sound of fighting emerged. Static came from the comms, but his voice still carried. "Large number of screamers, 3 spiders." "I can hold," he said. "Continue operation." He sounded strained, clearly in the middle of a struggle. "Kedra, with me," Atius called. "Windrunner, guard the boy. Keith, prepare a nightbreaker. Remaining units, hold position with Keith. We're killing this monster now, before the Winterscar gets overwhelmed." Atius leapt straight down the corridor, Kedra jumping out after him, blades lit. The feather tilted his head to the side, giving his neck a crack. He neither smiled nor seemed to particularly care, readying his hammer and shield as if it was business as usual. Atius swiped his sword through the air, occult imbued around it, launching out an arc forward that slammed against the tower shield and the sides of the rock walls. The shield held against it without any sign of effort, while the rock walls nearby were gouged out. The deathless Tut, not surprised the spell failed to do much. What it had done was force the feather to lurk behind the shield. Occult pulsed across Atius again, eyes trailing blue light. He twisted on himself, angling his fall, a white sword striking the floor and slowing the descent slightly. Kedra passed right by him. The feather peeked over the shield, then swung his hammer, right at my sister. Atius leaped further down, rolling into a kick that sent Kedra launching off to the side. She crashed against the wall, bouncing past the hammer's swing. It struck uselessly against the side of the wall, ripping it apart while the 2 knights sailed past him, striking out with blades against his shields. He grunted as the threats passed by him, then shrugged again and turned back to watch us. Specifically me. Kedra and Atius slid to a stop at the end of the corridor. "Hold position," Atius ordered, I'll assist the Winterscar captain. Take aim and open fire with the Nightbreaker while I keep them busy here." She nodded, reaching for the weapon behind her belt while Atius raced out of view to enter the fight and back up my captain. The feather stood his ground, waiting. "On 3, Kedra called out while I drew out my own Nightbreaker, one hand still holding onto the rope. "Copy, on 3. I sent back. "NNNNN. Enough." The feather grumbled and slammed his hammer again into the ground. A shockwave of blue raced out, shaking past my armor and dealing negligible damage. But I hadn't been the target. Instead, the rope I'd been holding onto snapped, and I slid straight down along with Windrunner and the other clan knights behind me. "Oh shit, 1 2 3. I shouted out in quick succession, pressing the trigger down. Kedra matched my attack, opening fire at the same time. 2 Nightbreaker rounds raced at the enemy from both directions. He let go of his shield, turned and slammed his hammer directly on Kedra's round. It squashed the Nightbreaker, chains and all into the ground. My own attack struck against the bronze shield, equally doing no damage. Okay, didn't think he could do that, but in hindsight we really should have guessed that he could. Damn. He lifted the shield up, letting it slam back down on my spent Nightbreaker, just to be a complete dick to my creations. The feather turned his gaze to me, judging the distance. "Close enough. Do it," he muttered. The tunnel behind me exploded. Rocks tumbled down as the corridor collapsed on itself, cutting off the Winterscar knights behind and leaving only myself and Windrunner in the clear. The rest were buried under the rubble. Nameplates mercifully remained green, the armor easily keeping them alive against something like a cave-in. But that left me falling directly down at a walking hydraulic press, looking at me like I was the next snack. I've been baited out. Wrath had been right, they'd seen us coming down here somehow. The hammer lifted up, a cold pulsing into it. Kedra screamed out behind, charging forward. She hadn't drawn out 2 blades, instead throwing her own rope and hook directly at the feather's neck with one hand, while her other brought up her occult knife in the familiar halo of blue. To her perspective, she was scaling a vertical cliff to reach an enemy. Even in relic armor with the advantage of the rope, she couldn't scale it that fast. She wasn't going to make it in time. I had no Nightbreaker, no rope hook to work with, and I was falling directly to my doom with little way to move myself out. Wrath was screaming in my head, the knights were yelling on comms, Kedra was trying to beat a world record in scaling a sheer cliff in seconds, and the only thing going through my own head was annoyance. My free hand reached out behind me, to a familiar prototype shield. One I'd spent some time working on. Of all the scrap shitbull I had to deal with, it's not even a single hour into this trip and I already had to use up my tricks. Oh well. Negotiations are at a standstill. Time to try alternate methods, like extreme violence. The front edge of the shield lit up occult blue. See, the one thing I'd realized could reliably block an occult blade was another occult blade, with exception to those massive might blast doors. But those cathedral-sized blocks of metal were basically impervious to everything and couldn't be stolen by any conventional means. At least, I hadn't come up with any ideas yet, work in progress. Occult blades as a shield though? That was doable. So that's what I did. I layered a bunch of occult blades stacked like a waffle on top of a metal shield. Enough to catch everything. All great except not much range or way to attack with it. It was a dingy little armguard that had the same reach as my fists. And that'd be all it could be if I were just a regular knight. Except I wasn't just a regular knight. I was a god's damned sorcerer knight and I wasn't about to let that go without being squeezed for every advantage I could think of. A cold pulsed around me and I sent out 3 ghosts ahead, each carrying a shield of their own. They blurred forward, aiming to surround the stunned feather. NNNNN. 3 deathless. A single blade could do good damage. But the surface area was a little small, hence why it took a few blows to whittle down a feather's shields. The Nightbreakers were the right way to go about it, with chains that would wrap up and apply 1,000 times more surface area. The occult shield was a little more humble compared to those monsters, but it certainly wasn't something to ignore when there's 3 of the angry things pushing down on someone's shields. The feather had 2 choices. Continue to wait for me to slowly reach his shield so he could squash me like a pancake, or leap backwards out of the way of the 3 occult ghosts currently rushing in to ruin his day. I was betting I'd take more time to fall down on his shield than it would take my 3 ghosts to cut through his own shield and then dice him up into neat little bite-sized silver cubes. He thought the same and wisely picked a leap backwards, trying to escape the occult ghosts. The hammer swung down, not on me, but swiping across all 3 images, dissipating them all. I hit his left behind tower shield a moment later, scrambling on top, powering my occult again. More ghosts were sent flying straight through the shield, zipping directly at him, swiping those wide arm guard shields. He ducked, dodged, punched, and slammed his hammer and pole in tandem, fighting off the specters with simple brute movements. He was pretty good at breaking my ghosts before I could generate another from them, forcing me to constantly start back from scratch where I was instead of pressing the attack directly into the fight. Then a hook wrapped around that tree trunk-sized neck and Kedra was on him the next second, stabbing away with her knife, outright furious, climbing around him in a way that he couldn't reach or grab her, swinging wildly. Stab, stab, stab went her knife, each time forcing his shields to trigger, while she swung around him using the rope, climbing over his body against the inverted gravity. His hand slammed the side of the wall, a cold pulsing through, leaving another handprint. It sucked in both air and Kedra, giving him a little room to breathe. He reached his hammer up, ready to slam down on my trapped sister before another swarm of ghosts harassed him. He was still breaking them apart faster than I could generate them, and I could feel my head growing sluggish from the excursion. Windrunner made all the difference. He hit the shield I'd been camping on, rolled and jumped off, a nightbreaker in his hands, safety off, aimed straight at the monster ahead. The feather raised his hammer in position, ready to slam the shell down. Only he didn't get that luxury, since my ghosts were once again harassing him from all sides. He punched one, kicked another, and then the nightbreaker round flew right at his chest, perfectly timed to the instant he wasn't looking. The feather grunted, moving stupidly fast for a mountain of muscle. Not quite fast enough, the round clipped his arm, the chains flying off and wrapping around. Shields lit up, flared and broke instantly against the deadly hug. An instant later, they cut off his arm and a large chunk of his chest. He leaped backwards, and made another mistake in doing that. He'd gone outside his gravity field. Windrunner flew directly at him, blade out, while Kedra clawed her way off the occult gravity well, and raced across his shadow like an assassin, hunched forward, dual occult daggers out for blood. Windrunner hit first, and battled the feather. The enemy held him off, hammer swinging out and finding a way to both repel the knight backwards and also slam down on the spent nightbreaker shell that ate his arm off in the same motion. This motherfucker clearly had resource denial as part of his goals, and being harassed by clan knights was not going to distract him from that. Kedra joined in a moment after, leaping at him with kicks and spinning blades. The feather fought both with one hand holding onto his hammer, swinging it as if it were weightless. Kedra managed to rake a blade across his head, cutting deep into his hidden eye, and stabbing a few more critical joints. Swings and strikes came lighting fast from all 3 fighters before the feather managed to nail Kedra with a kick that flattened her into the ground and pinned her in place under his bare foot, while his hammer flicked out against Windrunner mid-jump. It struck him dead on with a pulse of occult, sending the armor reeling off into the air, nameplate going orange. The hammer swung into position, high above Kedra, and then swung down all in one smooth motion. The weapon fell behind his back instead, a heavy clunk against the rock, his severed hand still holding onto it uselessly. The last working violet eye turned to gaze at the severed arm, spotting the trail of occult from where my ghost had struck. 3 more ghosts zipped into place. He jumped backwards to buy a second of time, taping his other foot on the ground, leaving an occult imprint there. Air rushed forward to the mark, but that didn't affect any of the chasing ghosts. Things like inertia and gravity didn't mean anything at all to the occult. He seemed to realize it a moment too late. Ah! He shrugged. I tried. Shouldn't have tried at all, asshole. I yelled back at him, and my images sliced through the machine without a shred of mercy. Book 4, Chapter 25, It Could Be Worse. The walking brick gazed up at me, a single violet eye still glowing. There wasn't any malice or hate in those like Tuekar, nor that glint of curiosity I'd seen in Wrath's eyes. He looked rather bored if anything, as if this was all just a terrible inconvenience and some Logi would fix it up soon enough if he waited long enough with a cup of coffee to draw them in. Even with his head bouncing on the floor, coming loose with a good handful of his chest. His chest had been sliced to ribbons, my occult arms healed cut through the bulletproof skin and artificial muscles with no resistance. White oil-like fluid came apart, staining the water around. The rest of the fight ended just about the same moment he had. An unheard call to retreat had sounded and the machine forces harassing Captain Sagrius instantly fled, regrouping deeper into the tunnel and leaving our team alive. Which only made me nervous. Machines generally ran in one direction, and it wasn't away from a fight. Always a pain when mooks are smart. I sent out to Wrath. Suffocate is not going to make this easy on us. Suffocate is not in command of this team. There is a third leading this team of feathers. Wasn't that a nice thought? The artificial gravity gave out, the world returning back to normal. Water sloshed back into the corridor, washing past our feet and carrying away the feather's own smaller parts, leaving a shallow pool that kept going back and forth with waves, rebalancing between the tunnel and the flat ground. A violet eye continued to stare at me, a good third of the head submerged in the shallow water. Wrath gave a mental shrug when I asked her how the walking brick was still alive. With no shell to support, the energy expenditure will be minimal. Machines do not need the majority of their shell to function, and a reserve amount of fuel is stored next to their fractals. I do not understand why he has not yet fled to the digital sea, however. He might want to trash talk a bit. He was pretty quiet during the fight, for a feather. Perhaps. Wrath agreed, clearly aware of her kind's dramatics. Nevertheless, this is an opportunity to eliminate another feather. So long as his soul remains within reach, the sword carried by your clan lord could eliminate him. That's if he doesn't run the moment he sees that drawn out. Tuekar's forged white sword, made with the true division fractal, could cut right into reality itself. Or at least, that's how it felt like when I'd seen that fractal in use. Maybe this feather wasn't aware we had a weapon like that ready to use. Report status. Atius ordered over the comms, taking steps to survey our surroundings, armored boots sloshing through the thin water while his great cloak was getting mildly soaked at the hem. All around him were cut machine parts, screamer arms, and spider legs alike. I hadn't seen him fight, but the remains scattered around him showed why deathless were considered second only to feathers. A set of responses came back over the general chatter. The few clan knights left had been buried under rubble behind me, unfortunate to have been just a little too far down the corridor. The Winterscar knights caught on the other side were busy trying to dig them out. Journey estimates it'll take an hour to cut a full path through that amount of rubble. Cathita said with an old sigh. Not often I see toasters make plans. Basically never. Machines are supposed to be as smart as a bug near a light. Pay. All this for a pair of tits. Not even real ones either. Squirrelings. Next time, go lick something else than electric sockets. Wrath was clearly upset by this, but not on the subject she should have been upset about. Please let the engram know that I have put considerable research into making my che. Nope. Not going to do that. I shut down Wrath before she could say innocent Wrath things. We didn't have the time to dig out the broken path. The temple was swarming with machines already, and more were soon to come. Had to get Wrath into the Might Forge and then run for it. Sagrius had taken a seat against a nearby wall, bringing out a medical kit and unhooking his right boots to tend to the injury. The soul fractal cut off most physical sensations, so pain wasn't a factor, he could easily continue duty with the broken foot for now. He still didn't want to lose a leg, knights didn't spend every day in their armors back home. And he knew we'd be on the move pretty soon. Kedra was lifting up the dead knights, bringing out small plates, hooking them up to her necklace. Both stable. She called out. Anka's voice scratched against the chatter, static fading into her voice even with the armor scrubbing out most of it and reconstructing her words to be more clear. Shadowsong to away team. Be aware, Suffocate has left her post and is going deeper into the temple. We opened fire and held her for a few minutes. Fractal plates floating around her were unshielded and vulnerable to shots. Effect was negligible, the feather repaired them with that black smoke of theirs. How long did it take her to fix up bullet hits? Windrunner asked, likely considering the tactical benefit. We all carried rifles with a few mags for each. They'd been mostly brought to deal with the smaller machines, but if we could leverage it against a feather. 5 to 10 seconds at most. Anka answered. Be aware, she returns fire almost instantly against threats like this. Protecting her weapon is likely a priority. Lord Atius nodded, kneeling by the feathers left behind tower shield, examining it. A vulnerability is a vulnerability. A few seconds in a fight may be all we need. Know something about the shield? I asked, pointing at the bronze slab Atius was tapping an armored hand at. I believe it's a cut section of a might blast door. Never seen a chunk discard like that, the material has always been impervious to everything. I'm not sure how the machines were able to get a section of it. He hummed, thinking. From the unaltered state of the thing, once they had their cut, they weren't able to do anything more with it. He took an experimental tug at the handle. The shield remained where it was, standing upright in the corridor, unmovable even with his relic armor. As I suspected. If only we had more time, bringing this back for study could have been a boon. Got any idea about it, Wrath? I asked our expert in feathers. How'd a feather in the middle of nowhere find a might blast door section? It is possible this feather intercepted mites while they were constructing a new blast doorway, and extracted a piece from it. That is the best I could guess. He may have spent months waiting for the moment. I'd bet an airspeeder punching more than just bullet holes in those fractal plates would ruin her day. Windrunner said over comms, having been mulling over Enka's report. You don't have the funds for an airspeeder, Windrunner. Father's scratchy voice sounded from Kedra's necklace. I've seen what you spend your coin on. Windrunner paused for a half second and then cackled. Harassing me even from the afterlife. Hat. Feels like old times never went away. Just missing Iron Reach and Shadow Song here for the full team. Guess a captain and the rookies will have to do in a pinch. They will. Everyone started as a rookie once. Atias said, now making his way to the feather's decapitated head. The next generation has always stepped up to the plate when called, time and time again. This group is no different. The full tally returned on our huts over the banter. Kedra, Atias, and I were the only ones on this side of the rock collapse that hadn't been injured in any way. Sagrius had his ankle and calf broken into pieces from the feather's hammer, but Windrunner had been hit the hardest of us all. In midair with a full swing of that hammer. He'd ended with a heavy amount of broken bones all across his body, though he hadn't flatlined like the other knights. Guessing it had to do with the other knights being smashed between the hammer and a wall. He shrugged his shoulders at the medical readout, noticing my own gaze looking him over. The knight hadn't bothered to open a kit or anything. That head poking out your sack, she'll be able to heal all injuries I hear. We restore her, and she will restore me. He said, pointing at the white hair and eyes left sulking in the sack. Can't go back to the surface to Iron Reach like this, prick won't let me forget it for years. He'll start telling me I should have made more jokes about proposing to a girl after the expedition's done like he does. Kedra walked over to me from the other side, lifting the ruins of a Nightbreaker shell. Lord Arius and I still have an unspent Nightbreaker round. The rest of our ordnance is behind that pile of rock, unfortunately. As is most of our ammunition. We will need to ration our resources now. She'd brought all 3 spent shells to me for inspection. The feather had gone out of his way to eliminate each whenever he had a chance, outright putting that as a higher priority above fighting off Windrunner and Kedra near the end there. Yeah, that's not getting fixed. I muttered, dangling the mutilated remains of my blood, sweat and tears. The chains had been warped, caught between a heavy hammer or shield and unyielding rock. Squashed, which meant the internal fractals had also been bent. The fractal of heat etched inside the palms of my hand lit up, quickly turning the chains red hot. I crumpled them into a ball in my armored hands. Can't let the enemy recover anything working from these. They aren't using chain weapons themselves, best not give them more ideas. We'll need to continue forward. Atias said, looking down the collapsed tunnel. Only a minute or so had passed since the end of the fight, but already the enemy was regrouping and probably planning more things out. There isn't time to dig out a tunnel here. Winterscars, recover the clan knights from the rebel and rejoin the shadow songs above ground. There was a noticeable pause on the other end, as the Winterscar knights were having a silent internal debate about that. It'll be fine. I spoke out. Kedra and I will make it out. Understood, Low Master Keith. One of the Winterscar knights spoke. We'll recover the trapped knights and rendezvous with the shadow songs. The comms clicked shut. Atias made no mention of the possible insubordination. Instead, he grabbed the head of the defeated feather, lifting it up out of the water. And you? Who are you? Who sent you? The violet eye turned from its perpetual stare in my direction, locking onto its captor. I am Torda. The one of resolve died ash. I sent a private comms, though I knew that feathers could overhear under the armors. Had to make it vague. You could use Tuekar's last gift to help us all out here. I said, hoping it was cryptic enough the feather wouldn't guess, but clear enough the deathless would. Atias brought a single finger to drum lightly on the pommel of his sword, the only indication he'd understood the message. Ask Wrath if they can track us with a head. The head contains the neuromorphic portions along with the general CMO's architecture and processing power. Wireless systems are located inside, although these are used only as last resort and are far less powerful compared to the systems integrated within the rest of the combat shell. The signal should be easily drowned out with your current equipment. She says he's got a small budget-tier emergency whistle with him. I said. But we can get the armors to jam it so long as we keep him close to us. Just in case. We'll keep him gagged, metaphorically. Atius nodded. Let's get moving then, we can interrogate him as we make our way in, for however long he remains. For now, we'll avoid the rooftops, as Suffocate might be able to get a bead on us. I suspect she'll start shelling us through the walls anyhow, but not letting her see where we were had already proved effective in the forest. The group gathered together and we started our path to the goal, jumping over rocks for easier traversal, splashing down against the water anytime it wasn't possible. Does your leader know what we're here for? Atius asked the head. Don't know. If it still had shoulders, Tuorda would have shrugged, I think. Ask him yourself. Cathita hissed. A comms frequency ping was sent out from the head in wideband. We muffled the signal without problem, but the contents were for us. Don't like this. Ping's probably the channel the feathers are using or something. Recommend you avoid it, but we both know you're a brat that doesn't listen to his betters. I haven't the faintest idea why I'm being accused of that, and quite frankly, I feel personally insulted here. How dare you, wench? Delightful. Wench. Is that really the best you have, dearie? I can offer a list of alternatives. Wrath sent to me. I've documented many new terms Cathita has shared in prior training sessions. I shushed her before she could make things worse, of course. Wrath was not particularly happy about that, given she felt proud of having assembled such a long list. Should we take the invitation? I asked Atius instead, as we sprinted through the broken temple. The chambers all had little or no roofing left stable, all of it crumpled long ago into the ground, the pool of water almost always a constant no matter where we were. Some parts looked deep enough to reach our knees. We were moving on pure luck, trying to follow the general direction where the Might Forge should be. Running into dead ends or being forced to sidetrack was common. All through the sprint, we could hear machines lurking around us, wailing out, but none came in sight. The machines already know we're here. The Deathless sighed, having mulled it over for the past minute. Perhaps it would be good to introduce ourselves. Go ahead and do the honors, lad. I doubt there's much you could say that would make things worse. They already want us dead. Everyone's a critic. I grumbled, swapping the frequency, taking a few coughs to clear my throat. Journey automatically set safeties on the comms to slow down any triangulation, same thing Abraxas used to keep us from finding him. We were set the moment it clicked green on my HUD. Hello Feathers. I think we haven't been introduced yet. Nailed it. Keith Winterscar. A low voice answered. Male. Age 21. Last recorded dead by Tarathha's blade. Last spotted alive in the digital sea, somehow. Percent probability of being involved with Tuekar's destruction at near 92. That wasn't Suffocate, so this must be the mysterious leader of the pack. His voice didn't sound deep, but there was still that synthetic quality to it, the same that had tinted Tuekar's voice. Wrath had that issue ironed out already, as she proudly reported to me before over lunch once. Wonder if it had to do with the generation? I see I have fans. Who should I write this autograph to? I am Tuevalis. Nothing else came after, which was odd. I thought Feathers were rather strict about their names and took pride in their meanings. Wrath had told me it was a general machine quirk. Any reason to come after us on this lovely day? There's no need to continue this act, Winterscar. We both know why you are here. And we both know what I want. Surrender to Wrath into my custody, and I will allow you and your team to leave without harm. Does everyone think I put myself into these situations because I'm trying to live a few years longer? If I wanted safety, I'd have ditched everything and ran off already to retire. Besides, we're the ones holding Tuorda's head right now, not the other way around. Think that says a lot for our survival chance. The voice didn't answer for a moment, as if contemplating. Surrender to Rathha's shell and I will argue in her defense against the Pale Lady's coming anger, and let you stay at her side unimpeded. I can offer a modified version of the chosen implants that will skirt rules mother set. You will have immunity to machine kind, without the shackles that come with the gift, letting you stay at Rathha's side without encroaching on your free will. Oh. This feather was different. That offer wasn't half bad even. Know who he is? I nudged Wrath. Friend of yours? No, I do not know this feather, or most feathers. The only one I had contact and communication with was Tuekar and briefly to Sefit. This chosen thing, not sure how you'd sell it to relinquished in the first place. I asked, curious. She is interested in destroying humanity as a whole. A single human, or even 1,000 humans, are insignificant to her gaze. You will die of old age long before she notices you exist. Why would you even try to defend Wrath? I've been sent to investigate Tuekar's death and nothing more. I hold no interest in what happens to you or to Wrath after I've submitted my report and all relevant people of interest. I can recommend to Wrath to be rehabilitated, or sent elsewhere with supervision instead of being destroyed. Well, sorry to disappoint, but I get this nagging feeling that's not going to end well. Like that subtle sense of danger watching a 50-ton airspeeder about to crash into you. I have successfully isolated you from the majority of your group. Tuorda will return shortly. He remains in your hands out of boredom, not inability. His personal presence isn't needed to craft a new shell, it is already in progress. In addition, I've already learned most of your abilities and offensive capabilities and will ferret out any last tricks you have shortly. I recommend you reconsider wisely, if not for yourself, then for the others you've brought with you. Are you willing to let more of them die in exchange for a machine? When you put it like that, I think you're running scared. I believe in results first. If I can avoid a fight, I will. When you change your mind, this channel will remain open. Tuovilis said. You will need it. The connection clicked shut. Book 4, Chapter 26, It Got Worse. NNN don't know. The talking head said in such a flat tone I think even with a full set of shoulders, Tuorda would be too apathetic to even shrug. Don't care. Bouncing with each footfall as our team sprinted through the initial channels, Lord Atius leading with Kedra at his side. Windrunner gave the head another shake, mid-sprint. Gods, fucking talk already you defective piece of scrap. The unkempt white hair made for a good handle that dangled up and down. Windrunner turned his helmet to us. I'm starting to think he's not being stubborn here, this scrap shit seriously doesn't know a single thing at all. Leader said guard tunnel. I do. Tuorda said, dangling almost horizontally from centrifugal forces as we took a sharp turn, all of us leaping over a set of rubble. Leader says stay, talk, give contact channel. I do. No other orders left to do. Why the gods are you still here then? To piss us off? Windrunner asked, shaking the head a little more than needed. NNNN, being carried. The gravely voice said, pausing with each word as if it were annoying to even speak. Unfamiliar. Get to move without effort. It's nice. Relaxing. If I could sleep, would be even better. Didn't know machines could sleep. Windrunner said. Why would you even need to sleep in the first place? Wrath? I asked, poking the feather carried on my back. I hadn't seen her sleep before, though I have seen her pretend to. Neuromorphic systems do benefit from a garbage collection process similar to organic mind. Wrath explained. However, we do not need to turn off all our functions for this to happen. The cleaning systems are automatic and non-intrusive. This may be a quirk of Tuorda specifically. Wrath says your guess is as good as hers. I said, to which Windrunner gave a few questioning glances before realizing I wasn't making a joke. Atius turned an eye to glance at the stump in Windrunner's possession, a set of calculations passing through before a conclusion was reached. Well then, why don't you go to sleep lad? Keith, see if you can get some space in your sack for an extra head. We'll interrogate him once all of this is over. Wait, you're serious? I asked, now both Windrunner and I looking at the Deathless expecting him to tell us it's a joke. Nothing more we can do with the head right now. Once we're more settled, we can consider ways to interrogate him that'll work. This is not a wise course of action. Wrath said through the link between us. Her working eyes flickered in my direction, violet glow narrowing down with accusation. Tuovilis had orders for Tuorda to follow in the event of his capture, which means this situation was predicted. We do not know if there are additional countermeasures Tuovilis planned out. Or if the head could be a danger to us in another way. She had a point there. We reached another dead end and instantly took the left, the sound of splashing puddles the only thing left behind us. No sign of any machines yet, though we have been sprinting for only a few minutes now since our fight with Tuorda. For the record Clan Lord, Wrath thinks this is a bad idea. I said, bringing up her points again. Maybe should ditch the head somewhere? Preferably kick it over a wall. I vote Kedra do it, she could probably launch it into the next level up. Kedra scoffed. Actually scoffed. The nerve. And here I was giving her a chance to show off. Last time I'm doing her any favors, swear to the gods. No need for anything so drastic, whelpling. I have plans of my own, for now carry on with setting the head in the sack. He raised a hand up, the motion for the group to stop. We slid against the waterway, while I was already opening up Wrath's sack, preparing it for a new neighbor. The other knights took point at the same moment, rifles up and aiming down range, covering angles. Still no machine anywhere. Just broken walls, and water leaking in between the cracks. While Wrath and I were privately debating the merits of keeping a living head as decoration, Atius had turned to the object of discussion himself. Should be good for you, You get to sleep and you won't hear orders from your boss. So long as you feed us information, you won't even need to move anymore. That seems good. Except, the head said, the single violet eye closing shut, already, deciding to waste no time on the offer. Windrunner held the head out, helmet glancing in my direction with clear befuddlement. He actually went to sleep, I think. In the middle of all this. Nevertheless, he held out the head so I could grab it. I mean, if machines really can SLE. A white machine sword flicked with lightning speed out of Lord Atius's scabbard, tip unerringly diving for the feather's lower neck all in one fluid motion. Even Windrunner, who was carrying the damned thing, didn't react to it in time before the blade had sunk straight through the machine's soul fractal. No pulse of a cold came. No feeling of something more being cut. Atius tutted, withdrawing the blade with disappointment before he re-sheathed it. He fled faster than I could get him. Seems he was either expecting this, or constantly on guard. A befuddled look down at Wrath reminded me I should probably close the sack again and strap it on. After all, it doesn't look like Wrath is getting a friend now. While the rest of her face was frozen in a neutral position, the eyes looked almost as confused as the rest of us. Windrunner shrugged, tossing the broken head behind him where it sunk halfway into the water. No plans to interrogate him? I asked, slowly reconsidering the past events. No. Only picking the best moment to catch him unaware. It's likely he did know information we could have used. Atius said, continuing the sprint forward, his gaze flickering at the walls around us, as if looking for patterns. He clearly had a plan in mind given the directions we were taking. The rest of us followed behind, quickly putting distance between us and the head. Unfortunately, as much as he liked to talk, we don't have the time to extract the info, nor the tools. Carrying him around will only give. Doug. Father yelled out over the comms. The group didn't question it, all of us diving into a sliding crouch, feet wide to force the maximum surface friction, slowing us all to a full stop. At the very same moment, the walls before us blew up. Or rather, 7 blue beams sliced through at an angle, and for a small sliver of frozen time, everything seemed perfectly still. The beams clear and bright, almost like the corridor was filled with dust and light was passing by. The shockwaves of the beams ripped the walls apart from the inside out wherever the beams had cut. That's all I saw before a massive chunk of rock slammed on my side and sent me flying into rubble. The hit had been dangerous enough to trigger Journey's shields, though the damage was negligible. Wrath in the sack remained in good condition, only one strap had snapped off. She was lighter than she looked, despite the ridiculous things she constantly ate. I don't think they appreciated us stabbing the head, I said, scrambling back to my feet and following the other knights. They were already leaping over the rumble, soaring through the cloud of brick dust fighting against the splashed water droplets, turning into muddy rain. Looks like I'd been the unlucky one here, having to deal with a rock to my face. That's not a good omen. You bugs are ever so quick to scurry around. Tisefit's voice echoed, amplified from somewhere far away. I admit, I haven't ever known humans to slip away so many times. Makes a lady wonder if she's lost her edge. Would you so kindly do me the honor of dying correctly this time? And that's an even worse omen. Father called out again, and beams lanced through the walls again, right in our path. This time a follow-up barrage came right on the heels of the first, trying to catch us wherever we'd crouched. Tisefit had us in sight somehow, and she wasn't holding back. The world shuddered around us, rock chips flying everywhere. The wall behind us had already been ripped apart by the first volley of beams. 2 more had turned it from something sturdy to an outright danger. It collapsed with a final groan, straight down on Kedra, the entire top part still solid enough to hold together. My heart froze at the sight. She gave a surprised yell and leaped into action. A relic armor in full sprint was incredibly fast. The collapsing ton of rock was faster. Kidra wasn't going to make it, not at the speed she was sprinting at. An arc of pure occult flew over my head, impacting the rock wall and shattering it apart. A second wave of occult chased right behind, insurance in case the first wave didn't do the job. The pile of rocks still collapsed straight onto Kidra, burying her for a half moment before her chest and arms broke free from the rubble, which was far better than being buried under a fully intact section. The family armor struggled out of the mountain of collapsed rock. I could hear the whine of motors trying, and failing to pull her completely free. "Can't," she called out, "too much. Seems I've caught one." Tisefit's voice echoed again, glee in every syllable, likely licking her lips. I rushed straight for my sister, probably screaming I think, occult rippling around as I sent image after image to slice and cut at the rocks with the arm guard I had, dice up the obstruction into smaller chunks her armor could push against. It was working, loose stone crumbling apart as more of her body was fighting for freedom. We could all dodge in some way. But Kidra was a sitting speeder, unable to move from her trap. "Get down!" Atias called out right behind me, likely sprinting right on my heels. "Keith! Get down! Damn you, get down!" Atias's voice felt far off, bouncing off me like snow blown against armor. "Much obliged for the generous meal." That damned voice echoed through the ruined rubble, low and husky, as if all of this was just a game to her. "I will gladly partake." Father called out to move, desperation in his voice, knowing equally well Tisefit wasn't going to miss a chance like this. The beams would slice through and rip apart everything, including the soul fractals. A foot kicked my knee joint and forced the armor to crumple on itself, breaking my sprint just as I was about to get to Kidra. That had been enough to avoid a beam Tisefit had sent for my head a half moment after. I could see it, looking distorted through the flaring relic armor shields holding off the shockwave that came after from being so close to the beam. In the soul trance I saw Atias continue past me, sliding directly next to Kidra, extending his hand out as his foot hit the collapsed ruin and forced him to a full stop. A beam that had been aimed perfectly for Kidra speared directly into his hand the moment after, and slammed against an unmovable wall of wool. Occult surged, whipping even the water in a wide circle away from him. Tisefit's beam battled against the white dome shield. Atias grunted in pain, one knee falling down, arm shaking. The beam held for a second more, then dispersed. The Deathless remained behind, occult evaporating off his armor like steam. "Oh!" Tisefit's voice called out. "You survived? Today is just filled with surprises." She seemed genuinely puzzled. From his position, 12 pale blue wraiths stepped out, each leaping forward against the rebel, slicing and attacking everything holding Kidra. Atias turned, exhausted eyes locking onto me. "Help dig her out, now." It shocked me back to my senses. My own ghosts flew straight out, joining in as I scrambled back on my feet. Something hit critical mass within the rock slide and Kidra's knee lifted out, shoving crumbling rock out of the way, as if she was walking out of the deeper side of the baths. The stone grip loosened all at once, deflating as she forced her way through. Father called out again. Tisefit wasn't done. Kidra tried to jump out of the way, but part of her was still climbing out of the rocks. The pause between volleys had been too brief. Atias grabbed her shoulder and shoved down, forcing her to stay put. The rest of us leaped in random directions. Another set of beams cut again, directly through the open air. Atias's eyes closed, mouth grimaced, and his hand snapped up once more, the dome shield summoned, shoulder and body braced into it. Tisefit's beam lanced through, battering the invisible barrier again. The impact echoed through his armor, pushing his hand and shoulders back. Sweat beaded on the old man's face, teeth grinding with effort. Shockwaves impacted the rocks around, pulverizing the smaller ones into pieces and throwing dust all across, obscuring the battlefield for a moment. The beams cut off, firepower spent. Atias's status on my HUD remained green. Tisefit tut. "You are quite the resilient specimen. I suppose my cute little sister picked her friends well. A shame she couldn't do the same for the rest of her decisions." Relief washed through me like a tide, as both the Deathless and Kidra sprinted out of the dust cloud, rejoining our group. We turned on our heels and ran. With so much of the walls ripped apart, there wasn't any more rubble Tisefit could use to pincer us. Tisefit didn't care. She was out for blood now. I think living this long had made it personal. "How's she finding us through the walls?" I yelled out, looking for any clues in the chaos around me. Father called out warnings again, death approaching all of us as the feather locked onto our positions somehow and opened fire far off. The beam sliced through the far wall side, blowing it up into white granite chunks that harmlessly crashed into the floor and water, much too far to be any threat to us. With the warnings Father had called out, we each leaped out of the way, avoiding the beams and letting our armor's shields soak the resulting pulses that came from them. We can't run from her, we need to engage her directly. Atius called out. Advance. We only got to our feet and hardly had the time to scramble before more beams came, shockwaves constantly ripping apart the very air with sound and confusion. This time she fired dozens and staggered shots, randomly aimed. There was not a single second where a beam was not in some way slicing through somewhere. They fired off like a machine gun. Father stepped up to the plate. With his sight, he could see all fatal attacks ahead of the hit. And he used it to call out individual knights with clear-cut instructions, honed with the clarity of 1,000 battles. His voice only grew more calm as the fight continued, old habits of command returning even as a ghost. We pressed forward, trying to make headway directly at the source of the firepower, somehow doing it. Why won't you just die? Tisefit said, sounding annoyed now. You are making thi. She paused for a moment, though the barrage of beams didn't abate. I get it. She said. This isn't working, yes, no need to point out the obvious so incessantly. I can handle myself, go pester to Orda or the Lessers. These humans are mine. The firepower stopped. We took the window for what we could, sprinting directly through ruins of walls between us and where Tisefit must have been firing from. Relic armors were already painting the likely location of origin. We barreled through the half-teetering remains of a thinner brick wall, arriving at the location predicted. Nothing waited for us here except for a large half-standing pillar, of which our HUD showed every line point intersecting. She'd been right here, firing at us through the walls from on top of that pillar. She can't have gotten far. Windrunner snarled. None of us relaxed in any way, eyes peeled open for any possible attack. 4 relic helmets looking around, with our deathless clan lord at the center, watching the world through open eyes, calculating. We don't yet know how the witch moves in combat besides walking. Keep alert. A ranged artillery unit must have some emergency methods of escaping an attacker. Father called out a warning, we scattered on command. No beams came. She's aborted her attack. Father said, voice on edge. Interesting. Very interesting. Tisefit called out, something in that voice sent a chill through my back. How exactly did you all start diving around only when I decided to fire? Some supernaturally honed instinct to live? My, tenacious. A shame that won't be enough. The world turned into hell the very next moment. This time an entire barrage of 24 shots opened up, slicing through everywhere like the wrath of gods, all at once. There was no way to dodge. No way to avoid it all. We were dead. A cult pulsed behind us, and ghosts of Atius leaped with full speed, reaching each of us, lifting a hand out into Sefit's direction. Most of her beams missed. Some hit. None got past the occult domes Atius summoned from each of his ghosts. A terrible howl came from the clan lord behind us, hoarse, filled with pain. The moment the beams faded, we turned, watching Atius collapse on both his knees, near pitch-black blood leaking from his mouth, eyes flickering, fading between unconsciousness and lucidity. Old tired eyes met ours, and drifted away as his body fell forward. Windrunner was at his side within the second, arms snapping out to hold the clan lord from complete collapse into the shallow water under. His teal helmet turned straight to us a moment after. I could almost feel the knight's panic. I rushed over, not sure what I could do, my legs still moving me anyhow. Atius sputtered, body shaking, coughing out. Black blood splashing down into the water, diluting back to red in the troubled water. He heaved, as if trying to gulp down air all the while choking still. One of his hands reached out blindly, trying to grab anything, failing at it. He was saying something, but even the armors weren't able to reconstruct the few intact syllables coming from him into anything audible. He wasn't getting back on his feet. The hand began to wave more frantically. Voice fighting against his need to breath. Kedra and Sagrius came to a stop, our group huddling over the clan lord, silently debating how to carry him out. Pure panic flashed through his gaze, eyes wide. Father didn't make another call out yet, which meant Tisefit wasn't firing at us again for now. My. How exciting! The bitch's voice called out instead, happy for some reason. You've really outdone yourselves, tiring me out like this. But now, without your deathless. The chill raced again through my spine. Atius wasn't flailing around out of panic, suffocating on his blood. He'd been trying to warn us. We'd all huddled into one convenient target. This is the part where I finally kill you all. In the face of complete annihilation, Captain Sagrius rose before any of us could act, turning to face the direction Tisefit would fire from. Shield fractals began to glow across his armor, called on by his will. He took a step forward. I must protect the young lord. He whispered, more a litany than anything truly said to anyone. His relic armor automatically amplifying the silent prayer to audible levels. There was something strange in his voice, a distortion growing with each sentence. Crackles of occult were drifting across his plate, across the glowing shield fractals that lit up bright. He lifted a hand before himself, watching it as if pleading to it. I am a knight retainer, and I will honor my vow. Directive, acknowledged. His armor whispered back. The hand snapped forward, palm out. Tisefit opened fire. 24 beams ripped apart everything in their path, obliterating ground and air alike, more a force of nature incarnate. Uncontrolled and inevitable destruction. They converged into one point, one target. Book 4, Chapter 27, Unpayable Cost. Light and sound crashed with the full fury of an avalanche. Nothing more than a black silhouette stood between us and the blinding white-blue destruction. Ground ripped apart around our group in a semicircle, as if we were standing in the eye of the storm, somehow safe while the rest of the world tore apart. The occult dome stretched wide before Captain Sagrius, wider than any I'd seen before. He staggered back for a moment, knee dropping down for support, before slowly rising back up, inevitable. Between him and Tisefit's full power, one broke first and it wasn't the captain. Her weapons winked out, energy spent, leaving melted rock and glowing embers all around our small island of safety. Steam wrapped a hand around the world, a thick white cloud of vapor that hung almost endless and hid everything from sight. Relic armors displayed linework of the expected topology, orange grids showing a virtual space within our HUDs, superimposed on the obscuring steam. It rose on a current of warm air, picking the cloud apart. Sagrius's arms dropped back to his side. He remained upright, staring straight ahead, silent, and alive. The terrain emerged around us as the steam lifted. Far away, the final wall Tisefit hid behind had been utterly blasted apart from her attack, revealing her position. She stood regally on the top of another half-cut pillar, staff extended out, dropping down to her side with slow grace, mirroring the captain's. Well, she said, violet eyes widening in surprise. Tuovilus was right. It seems I can't quite kill you by myself. My. How unexpected. Strategy. Windrunner hissed, still holding the clan lord with one arm draped over his shoulder. Atius didn't answer, still hacking black blood into the steaming puddle of water that remained by our feet. Draining away now into the cut ground to our sides, sizzling on contact with the half-melted stonework. A hand shook, and he painfully formed a hand sign. Take command. Windrunner nodded then let go. Atius fell to the ground with a merciless thud. Acknowledged. He said, voice emotionless, hand reaching down, unclasping Atius's Nightbreaker launcher with quick and practiced motions. Assuming command. Keith, Kedra, flank. Sagrius and I will run vanguard. Advance. He rose up, and sprinted straight forward. Simple plan, but we didn't have time to come up with a better one. Standard playbook here. Anything is better than nothing. And Tisefit wasn't opening fire on us. She'd had pauses between rounds before, but this was already well within her firing window range. Which meant she should be attacking again any moment now. Instead, she looked like she was reviewing the battle, contemplating what to do next. Couldn't let that go on uninterrupted. Kedra and I dashed off to the right, sprinting over the destroyed terrain, advancing directly at Tisefit from an angle. Draw Nightbreakers. Windrunner hissed through the comms. Kedra yanked her own launcher out, safety clicking off. Winterscars, run interference. Windrunner said. We'll need to pin Tisefit into a position she can't escape or dodge. Kedra, open fire at first opportunity. I'll match. Relic armors calculated our current speed with the distance to target. 30 seconds was all we'd need before we were within melee range of Tisefit. 30 seconds was all she needed to fire at least 2 or even 4 volleys. We might just be able to make it if Father calls out accurate directions. On my minimap, 2 dots remained in place. HUD showing the nameplates. The first was expected, Atias hadn't recovered yet. The second wasn't. A look behind made it clear it wasn't some glitch. The captain stayed still, like a puppet, right where we'd left him. A cold feeling welled in the pit of my stomach. Windrunner noticed at the same time I had, realizing he was sprinting straight at a feather alone. Whatever flashed through his mind, he must have concluded there's nothing he could do other than commit fully. No time to worry about that right now. We had a feather to kill. Kedra, Windrunner said, voice deadly calm. Sagrius likely indisposed. Command falls to you if I'm taken out. Atias is deathless, he's died before and knows the score. Don't prioritize him. Make sure you and your brother make it out. Confirm orders. Understood. Kedra confirmed. Tisefit tilted her head with curiosity, blinked, and lifted her staff once more. I had a feeling she'd overheard us under our helmets, but nothing we could do about that. The staff aimed downrange at Windrunner, metal plates behind her circling in a pattern of 2 concentric rings, moving in opposite directions. A cold crackled like lightning between the plates, the dome shield Wrath had described appearing. Protecting the feather from the proximity danger of her own attack. The plates flew further away from her, spinning faster and faster and then froze in their tracks all at once. A single probing beam lanced out from Tisefit, gouging a hole into the ground to Windrunner's right. He leaped into a roll to his left almost simultaneously, avoiding the majority of the damage, relic shields triggering to absorb the ambient damage. It hardly took any percent off his reserve, the HUD showing him hovering around 98%. Interesting. Tisefit hummed. Delayed reaction now. Was that Deathless using some kind of prediction area support spell? Her hand lifted up, palm extended out to her side, as if she were about to grab us. The feather hadn't even bothered to look in our direction. 2 metal plates twisted in the air to face us. A cold glowed, portals appearing within both, leading into some place filled with machinery and the dark hollow of a massive barrel. That's all I got to see before Feather called out a warning through the comms, voice clear and direct. Kedra leaped directly to her right without a word, landing hard on her shoulder and turning it into a roll, while I slid on the gravel, crouching down. Above my head, a beam speared out, while another crackled right through where Kedra had been. Not the Deathless then. Ah, how rotten. Tisefit said, now giving us attention. Which one of you is calling out those instructions? 15 seconds until we reached her. She was onto us. Tuekar had quickly figured out non-lethal hits wouldn't show on Father's death sight, and had instantly changed his combat strategy back when he fought against Wrath. How fast would Tisefit catch on? Trick question, I wasn't going to let her catch on at all. At this distance, there was something I could do to throw a crowbar into her plans. A cold crackled around me, and I dove for the mirror fractal, reaching for every bit of training I'd done with Atias. Using it while running was going to be difficult, especially with what I planned. But one image was all I needed. Nothing too complicated. The real fight would be keeping it alive within range. I sent it out, watching it soar through the air at ridiculous speeds. The fastest I could imagine it going. Gravity and air resistance both had no hold over the wraith as it sprinted over, bounding leap after leap. Father called out another warning to all 3 of us left. Once more we followed orders, dodging the shots that would kill us, and tanking the damage that wouldn't. While I'd been dodging, she speared out my image, the beam slicing through the ghost with no resistance. It whisked out of existence, my plan scrapped out the airlock. I gritted my teeth, and summoned another, sending it once more after her. Willing it to go faster. It leaped ahead, and was promptly speared again by another beam, while the 3 of us were forced to abort our sprint in order to dodge her shots. She was testing the waters, trying to find out what triggered our group's ability to avoid her shots. Only a matter of time until she figured it out. One more chance. Think. Imagine. Gravity was nothing more than a force that tied physical objects down. The occult wasn't physical. The mirror fractal fuzzed in my mind as I exerted more thought. Faster. It had to be faster. It had to soar through the very air. Size was relative. Everything was relative. The fractal refused to comply. The instructions I sent, rejected. I wasn't thinking about this the right way. Tisefit drew the staff in Windrunner's direction, 12 plates turning to track him. A gut feeling deep within called out to me. If she opened fire, Windrunner would die. Suffocate was going to attack in a pattern that wouldn't let him escape. I simply knew. I forced every ounce of will I had into the mirror fractal. I needed some kind of edge, now or Windrunner was as good as dead. If the occult didn't answer to my imagination of gravity, then I'd make it accept my own reality. The soul tendrils within my mind flailed around the concept of that fractal, seeking out all the hidden edges within the no-man's land of broken cracks. The occult never respected physics in the first place, why should I? Everything was wrapped in concepts to the occult, and so was gravity. Just one massive concept so large and taken for granted I'd never seen it in my occult sight. Something in my head finally clicked. My tendrils found something to hold onto deep within the fractal, a dimension that had been ignored. I didn't question it, and threw myself at the mirror fractal again. A ghost of my image soared out, straight up, less like a cohesive figure, more like a wisp of pure occult. It arched directly down at the feather, moving as fast as a tracer bullet. Faster than anything had any right to go, flying freely through the air. Suffocate spotted it, two plates turning to fire, both unable to track the spell fast enough. The ball of occult split into two, falling into a complete stop, one in front and the other behind her. Both materialized into fully realized images, as if my ghosts had simply appeared. She picked a guard against the one in front of her, head turned to keep watch over the one behind. I dismissed the one in front, no longer needing it, now that I had an image right against her undefended side. My real arm's shield lit up with the occult blades all across, and so did the copy on the ghost, now too close for her to shield against. She drew her staff around, letting the shield vanish, exactly as planned. My image lunged forward, the arm guard zipping through the air. I stumbled back on my feet, realizing I'd crashed into the ground at some point channeling that spell. My mind felt off. That feeling of elucidation fading away like melting snow in my palm. But the mirror fractal remained working, and that's all I needed. Suffocate expertly ducked my image's attack, staff whistling around in an uppercut. Occult pulsed with it, air flowing like a stream behind, the gust heavy enough to throw even loose rocks on the ground up. With the dust swirling around, it almost looked like a dozen streaming pillars, and every one of them went through my image, immaterial. Enough force would break these ghosts apart, a punch or kick. Even a rock thrown. But air? It did nothing to the ghost. I tapped into the mirror fractal again within my armor, and the mirrored version on my image lit bright. From there, another ghost appeared as the first image faded. I wasn't keeping more than one image active, just constantly refreshing a single image. If Suffocate was surprised her gust didn't throw the melee combatant away from her, she didn't show it. The mirror lunged forward. She twisted away in place, refusing to give up her high ground, gracefully stabbing the end of her staff directly into the ghost with an occult blade at the end. Not before it had already generated another image, which dove to the side and attacked again. Suffocate tutted, aware that we were getting closer. I might have stumbled, but both Kedra and Windrunner hadn't. They doubled down, rushing at a full breakneck sprint. Suffocate sent a far faster jab from her staff than any before, trying to destroy the ghost before it could split. But that was useless, I was already copying it again, letting the first image vanish right as her staff ripped it apart. Again and again I generated more copies, most not even given any attack pattern. Just avoid hits and remain close enough to be a threat. So long as the image was within attacking range, Suffocate couldn't turn that staff to protect herself for another bombardment. No shield, no attack. Simple plan. The plates around her twitched impatiently, still tracking their enemies, but unable to open fire. It was working. There were a few dozen occult edges crisscrossed on my arm's shield. Just one solid hit with that and her personal shields would take a huge chunk to hold off that much surface area. If she ignored my image and tried to fire her beams, it would open her up to a free backstab. That would be a cost she couldn't pay. For once, things were going my way. I had the right idea generating images with no intention other than to dodge. It let me keep up with her increasingly fast pace. She might not have been a melee fighter, but Suffocate was still a feather and they could all move stupidly fast. I wasn't reacting, rather assuming she would pop them out of existence within a half second, no idea how or with what move, only certain she would. I wasn't wrong. She moved faster and faster, becoming more frantic in her attempts to eliminate the ghost. My image danced around her, destroyed over and over again, always one step ahead. The staff whipped around, now with no wasted movements, stabbing through each image, and instantly turning to chase after the next. Gone were her fluid and graceful strikes, she wanted that image gone. 10 seconds until Kidra and Windrunner were onto her. Windrunner aimed the Nightbreaker with one hand, the other hand keeping his blade at the ready. Kidra and I were racing over rocks, vaulting over any obstacles with little issue. Tisefit stopped, then turned to look up. As if something else had caught her interest. 5 seconds until we reached her. The occult metal plates started to move again, portals closing on each, before they circled around her, retracting back into a tight-knit orbit around her staff, midway through a parting swing. They flowed like water streaming after the source. She turned the attack into a graceful spin, leaping far into the air. A shadow overtook the land under us. Something large flew across the air from behind, with a screech that echoed everywhere. A massive metal bird, pulled straight from a nightmare, 8 violet eyes glaring down at us, 4 on each side of the half-skull-like mask. Its wings were the same design Tarath used, only scaled up by a massive factor. Hundreds of blades all held together by nothing and yet still in cohesion. Tisefit's upward momentum ended, and she began to fall back down to the ground. The massive machine swooped under her at the apex of her jump, letting the feather land with little issue. It circled around, taking further altitude, Tisefit as its only passenger. It seems my illustrious leader doesn't believe in my chances of success anymore. Her voice echoed out, with an edge of manic insanity to it. Even my own prediction programs were giving it a coin toss. Can you believe that? Me. A coin toss from losing. Exciting, isn't it? I would have loved to see how this would have ended. The uncertainty. Ah. She smiled, walking by the spine of the monster as if the speed it was soaring was immaterial to her, another hand lightly going from spike to spike like guardrails on a stairwell. The metal plates streamed behind her staff, trying to keep up with the bird's speed and remain at her side. Scatter! Windrunner called out. We have no means of reaching her on a moving aerial platform like that. We've got to retreat. With images that could bypass gravity, I could possibly reach her if I tapped into that power again. But I couldn't beat her at my best already when she was rooted to her spot and in range. No chance now that she was nearly out of range and moving around. We were sitting targets, out in the cold. She won't fire. Kidra spoke, coming to a stop and unstrapping her rifle, switching the safety off and verifying the weapon was good to fire. If she could fight from the safety of that machine's back, she'd have already done so from the start. Tisefit has not shown any sign of moderating her attacks from the start. Every attack was either to kill or to learn our patterns. She aimed, and opened fire. Yellow sparks appeared on the bird's metal carapace. It glared down at her, the bullets uselessly flying off its armor. The bird circled again, giving a heavy shriek of anger. Talons trailing behind large metal legs, curling and uncurling as if anticipating a meal. Kidra stopped her fire, growling. Wrath, what even is this? I asked. In human terms, you address them as ravens. A higher tier machine reserved for the 7th strata and downwards. Wrath said, watching the skies from her sack. It should not be here. Mites don't allow Mother many chances to build such machines in mass. They're expensive, and she tries to conserve resources when she can. From up there, Tisefit could have just bombarded us anywhere we tried to run, and there'd be nothing we could do. Except she hadn't. And I think I know why. Her dome shield can't cover more than herself. I said. She opens fire on us from there, her mount dies from the splash damage. And Wrath says she can't get another one easily. Given that Tisefit held her ground against my image instead of trying to move away, maybe this particular feather's malfunction was a pride thing about never breaking into a sprint? Her stupidly ornate robe might get ripped up or something and she cared more about that than winning at all costs. If her mount got off D, how would she get anywhere unless she ran on foot? Hardly dignified for a lady of her stature, if that's how her mind worked. Always had to attribute extremes when it came to feathers. They were all dialed up on dramatics. You have a few minutes of interlude while I look for a better spot. I suggest you think up a better plan. Tisefit said, proving my point. Or call up to Ovalis and accept the offer to surrender, though I would hope you don't. This has been very fun, a shame to see it end on such an anticlimactic note like that, wouldn't you agree? It's going to end with us stabbing you to death. Maybe I might even put your head on a spike, we're surface savages after all. I said, using that comms channel of theirs. I knew she could hear, because her gaze snapped my direction, a smile blooming over it. Brave words. She laughed, hiding her mouth with the back of her hand. Why, if you keep glaring at me with such passion, this lady might even swoon. Scraphead even had the audacity to wink as her mount whisked her away to safety. Miserable lousy wench. Wrath seated, actually upset. You should consider letting loose the catheta engram on the feather channel. I believe that might be considered a war crime. I sent back. I thought you took pride in committing those? She got me nailed there. I'll hit them with catheta once we're sure we don't need a channel to them anymore. The moment we send catheta there, they'll shut down the channel in a few minutes at best. The real catheta might eventually run out of breath, but not our version. She'd rage around and never stop. I had to keep all options open. A direct link to this Tuvalis might come in handy later. We'd started with a full army of the best knights the surface had to offer, equipped to the teeth. Now, there were only 3 of us left. Atius was out of commission, having overextended himself using the shield fractal, afflicted by something that was tearing him up on the inside. And Zagreus. I didn't know what happened to the captain. He remained staring vacantly ahead, right at the apex of the ruined ground. We'll get him back, whatever it was that happened. Somehow. I was the occult specialist, I'll fix this. I'll solve, bend, or break whatever rules I need to get him back. He's not gone. And if he is? The group watched Tisefit soar away, the bird diving down further off to the center of the temple, relocating deeper into the structure. If he is gone, either I'll cut Tisefit down, or I'll be cut down myself at the end of the day. But one of us wasn't walking out of this temple alive. Book 4, Chapter 28, Turnabout. Tisefit was gone. Despite this being the middle of enemy-held territory, everything felt silent. That gave us some time to lick our wounds. Windrunner was at Atius's side, helping the Deathless up. The clan lord hadn't recovered yet, still having a hard time just breathing. Black blood kept building up in his lungs, hacked out with wet coughs. Zagreus remained standing where we'd left him, gazing vacantly into the distance. He didn't turn to watch me come closer. "Captain, are you all right?" I asked, waving a hand in front of him, fearing the worst. His head turned, snapping to my direction. "Unknown," he said in a calm voice. "User unresponsive." I almost wished he hadn't spoken. That manner of speech. "Are you his relic armor?" "Affirmative," the captain said. It was his voice, the same deep scratchy worldness of it behind each syllable. But the words, it wasn't him. "How's that possible?" I asked, mouth faster than my head. I've already seen the occult do stranger things. For a moment, Father had outright possessed Winterscar. If it could happen one direction, it could go the other. Natural language predictive transformer unable to generate acceptable solution to the query. All answers fall below 20% confidence threshold. He spoke, helmet still turned my direction, unflinching. I'd heard that very same phrase before. Swallowing, I asked the same question I had all these months ago. "What is the highest answer you have?" And from now on, lower required confidence threshold for any question we have. I need answers, just pick the highest rank and go with that. Had a feeling I'd need to ask more than one question to figure out what's going on. Affirmative. Configurations modified. I am unwillingly consuming my user's soul. His voice remained monotone. That didn't help any of my growing panic, of course. Unwillingly? Can you stop? I am unable to stop the process, I do not understand how to stop. Kedra approached from behind us, walking over to the captain. She glanced at me, and even behind the faceless helmet, I could tell she was hoping I'd know what to do. Only one way to know what was going on. I was the occult specialist here, time I started pulling my weight. I opened myself further into the soul sight, fumbling around for the soul fractal within Zagreus's helmet. I found the fractal, but nothing within. Empty. I searched with a tendril, floating it out into the cold harsh world, until I reached the relic armor's own soul fractal. Here I found a mess. Zagreus was still there. Or at least, the concept of his soul remained. Diminished, intertwined with the armor. Linked back to his body, comatose. And, almost like osmosis, bits of his soul were flaking off, floating over into the relic armor's own soul, almost pulled like gravity. They touched on the relic armor's own depths, and merged within. The relic armor wasn't aware of its own soul, not like humans were. We could manipulate, move it around, shape it into tendrils. The relic armor seemed more trapped inside its soul fractal. Place me next to him. Father said from his base of operation on Kedra's necklace, rousing me out of the soul trance. I've learned much about souls and the occult in my time here. I may be able to help. Windrunner lifted Atius, cutting loose the great cloak, locking the clan lord's armor to his back. Relic armors had hidden hooks for all kinds of gear, and one thing they could do was carry another armor back to back. Kedra, grab Sagrius. We can't stay here for long. Time isn't on our side. His own armor whined at the strain of lifting a 400-pound armor, especially with the damage he'd taken earlier, but Windrunner's armor was up to the task. Kedra did as asked, grabbing her necklace and draping it over the captain's own neck. In the soul sight, I saw not just Father, but other knights within the multiple soul fractals in that necklace reach out. It took Father only a few moments to come up with a plan, moving tendrils into walls that held off the captain's essence from drifting away. The other knights joined in, trying to copy Father's own movements with far less finesse. The broken motes of Sagrius's soul collided against the makeshift walls, but didn't merge. As I thought. Father said. The concepts and identity that make up my soul is different enough from his that we cannot merge. Winterscar generated an engram of me, and in doing so, it became too similar to myself. That's how I slipped inside. The resonance was an open door, unguarded. Sagrius has done the same, become too much like the armor, allowing it to connect to him. I suspect that's how he gained the single-minded focus to resist Tisefit's attack. The two worked together as one. Only, the separation at the end of their task was impossible. Can you separate them yourself? Kedra asked. Not yet. I can slow down the process, too much of him was tied to the armor. Enough that even his body moves as if it were the armor's. A mental image of where Feather was looking at was sent out to all of us looking in with the soul sight. Tendrils of Sagrius's soul had reached out, connecting to the relic armors. Those hadn't been severed. In effect, I couldn't tell where the captain began and where the armor ended. What I could sense was Father's intention. He needed to find a way to cut a part of a soul somehow. If he could cut off those tendrils, Sagrius would be separated from the armor, and then his soul could be dragged away back into an empty soul fractal, safe from the world. Kedra lifted up the comatose captain, hooking his back to her own. He made no move to assist, nor fight back. Windrunner nodded, turned, and began on a slower sprint. He didn't trust his armor could jump with another armor strapped behind him, vaulting over ruins was out of the question. So our group was forced to follow the water trails. The Might Forge was growing closer, our navigation point remained fixed on it. The feathers haven't attacked us with any lesser machines. Not since our fight with Torda. I said as we make our way through the temple. Kedra nodded grimly at that. Even fighting against Tisefit, none appeared to play interference. I am not well versed in machine tactics, Wrath, is this expected? No. Wrath sent back. Machine doctrine is to send all lesser forces against the enemy with little reserve. Only stronger units are more strategically used. As far as I am aware of, I am the only feather within the last dozen generations to attempt to preserve my forces. At least, until now. Preserve forces at. Windrunner hummed. I see a possible reason now. Tisefit, her weapons aren't made to hold back against friendly fire. If she threw her forces at us to tie us down, they'd have been blasted just as much as we'd have. Then again, machines aren't known for holding back anything. If they could have sacrificed a dozen screamers just to force one of us to stay still for a beam, they should have. That is the standard doctrine. Runner models are easy to produce and require very little specialized machinery to create. Wrath said. Tuovilus is not behaving as other feathers would. Tuovilus doesn't have an actual army here at all. I said, putting the pieces together. Think about it. The moment we killed Torda, he sounded the retreat for them. Whatever forces he has here, he must not have been able to fully restock an army in the short time he had. I'm sure feathers could move fast enough to make it here, hence why all three of these feathers were lurking around. The minions move a lot slower. His first goal had been to divide us into smaller, more easily managed subgroups. And then try to further whittle us down from a safe distance. Whatever forces he has here, it's the bottom of the storage bin scrap I think. Anything he could work with that was nearby. That winged machine doesn't seem low quality. Windrunner said. Looks mighty expensive to me. Also looks stupidly fast. I said. Not surprised it managed to make it here in time. We made a good call heading here right away. Any later and he would have had an actual army to throw at us. That said, now that Tesefit's run off, we might be able to move on the roof level. Make a direct line to the Might Forge. Windrunner nodded. That means time isn't on our side. More machines are on their way. The longer we take to reach the Might Forge, the worse it will get for us. We need to get there as fast as we can. No, Kedra said. This entire time we've been playing into Tuovilus's plans. He's set the stage, and we have all been reacting instead of acting. If we make an attempt for the Might Forge, we need to do it in a way that he isn't prepared to handle. Windrunner didn't say anything for a moment, focusing on his run. Then he sighed. You make a point. But how do we surprise a feather that's got us running around his palm like this? I would recommend disabling his intelligence first. Wrath said, watching from her sack. He must have found some means of tracking you and your group. Tesefit's attacks were too well placed to have been blind fire. And feathers do not have means of seeing through walls. So he's tracking us somehow already. Lovely, always wanted another machine stalker. Don't think he'll end up the same way you did though, Wrath. Maybe he has a spotter of some kind. We could use standard doctrine against other side or long-distance weaponry. Windrunner said. There's a list of potential means to track targets. We can start by ferreting out his spotter, and then move on to verifying he isn't tracking us using software, a mole, or some kind of long-range vision. He'd need something that could keep up with full relic armor sprints. I said, following the group behind at our safe speed. There's no roofing anywhere here, just large chambers with pillars, walls, and pooled water with leaves growing anywhere dirt might have appeared. If he was tracking us, he'd need some kind of unit that traversed things effortlessly. That bird could have been above us the whole time, keeping sight. We have to figure out how it hid from sight. Windrunner was taking random turns on each chamber, hoping to confuse the enemy on our ultimate endpoint. If he's got a more conventional spotter following us, it would have to be a Drake. That's the only model of machines known to surpass relic armor sprinting speed. Windrunner said. Problem with that is that Drakes like to bounce when they jump from roof to roof. We should have seen a pipe lizard making the rounds by now. It is not a Drake model. Wrath said. The terrain is too chaotic for their kind to smoothly move through. As Windrunner demonstrated, we would have seen the bounce. You sound like you have an idea. I said. I do have a suggestion. The terrain here is varied enough the spotter cannot have visual contact all the time. There must be some amount of blind spots that occur as the machine follows behind. The wrong terrain could force the machine model to take paths that we could use to ambush it unaware. Windrunner nodded, putting it together. We find a narrow set of corridors that leads to a larger open room. Then kill our speed and instantly take the corners. Wait a second, flash the strongest short-range ping out. If we have any tails, they'll lose sight of us long enough to stumble close enough. A strong ping from our armors should be able to detect them all if they don't have any warnings it's coming. That will have to do. Kedra said. Now we're at the mercy of luck to stumble on the right location. No, not luck. Windrunner said. Atius wasn't running around without a plan. He was surveying the area, following a shallow sweep pattern. The Might Forge wasn't his end goal. I think he was already planning on turning the tides on Tuovilus. He didn't have a plan yet, but he knew map knowledge would be critical for whatever we came up with. There's a spot we already passed that would be perfect for this kind of ambush. The group doubled down on the sprint, cutting a corner and backtracking a different route. It took only minutes to reconnect with our past exploration. From there, Windrunner took a few obstructing turns, making our end goal less obvious until the very last turn, where we sprinted down a wider corridor at full speed. The moment we reached the turn point and vanished from the corridor, Kedra and I dove to the left, while Windrunner took the right. There were sounds approaching in the silence. Like metal rods clinking against rock, only it felt like hundreds of it. A second later, the sound was nearly on top of us. Windrunner sent out the ping. The machine scrambled to try and stop, their own sensors detecting the incoming wave, but being too far committed to get out of the way. We got an answer. Scan returned. Showing we're being shadowed by 4 spiders, 2 on each side of us. Let's take them down. Windrunner said. Atius coughed then, hand reaching out to make signs. Enemy. Eyes. Redundancies. Threats unseen. Strike all at once. Wrath was the one who picked the meaning apart, violet eyes staring at the clan lords shaking hands. I don't know when she'd learn the surface hand signs, but she knew enough to cut through even his shaking. The spiders are the threat we can see. What's important is the threats we can't see. Tuovilus must be tracking us with multiple redundancies. If we eliminate the spiders without eliminating the other methods, he can recover. We need to eliminate every means of tracking us all at once, along with mapping another route. Windrunner nodded, lifting up from his crouch before continuing his sprint forward, Kedra and I following. Somewhere behind us, 4 spiders skittered away, cautious to not be seen and agile enough to make that a reality. Kedra, Windrunner, and Wrath all started swapping ideas on other means Tuovilus could be tracking our group. There were still other bits of information we could use. It's been a quarter hour since we've breached the temple and he still hasn't sent any other machines to attack us. Even with a limited amount of machines, he'd still at least try to probe out our full strength. Wrath's thoughts was that his forces were already tied up somewhere we'd be forced to go through, and he wasn't going to divide his soldiers on a possibly failing attack on us. When the machines under his command were played as a card, it would likely be an all-in. Kedra brought out that the separated knights wouldn't just sit idle behind the rock wall. They'd go looking for another way into the temple, and by now they'd have found it. So Tuovilus also needed to consider dealing with a larger group of knights running around the temple. He might be using them to bait those knights out of position while he dealt with us. She was convinced on one point, he'd gone out of his way to separate me from the rest of the expedition. That meant he didn't think he could win with the forces he had against our relic knights. Which put an upper number to what he actually had to work with. He couldn't have dozens of spotters running around if he was fortifying a choke point. So how else could he track us? No. Not thinking about it the right way. I should pick out the earliest he'd started to track us and go from there. The tunnel, Tuorda had been sent there to hold us off. So he must have known by then where we were. And down there, there's no visibility. The spotters weren't the main way he was keeping us in sights, they were the backup. When was the point that he didn't have visibility on us? Suffocate opened fire on us with several walls between, and those had cut through like a heated pole through snow. Her range of fire is likely limitless in tactical terms. But when we first retreated into the forest, she should have been able to shoot through. Instead she remained stationary. No pursuit. So my guess is that she can shoot blindly, so long as she had a spotter. Somewhere between that point in the forest and our group going down into the tunnels, he'd found a way to track us. Something we couldn't see as humans, and relic armors wouldn't notice either. The right kind of signal could be both. All relic armors, I announced, cut off any signal you're sending, then search for anything still being transmitted from armors around you. Book 4, Chapter 29, Outfoxing the Fox. Cathida purred like a cat spotting a pipe weasel. Right on the gold, dearie. There's still 5 signals being sent, 1 from each of us. Not software either, signals seem to be separate from the armors. How did you miss an entire set of signals being sent out? I asked. Only the real Cathida gets to say she's too old for this scrap shit, you're part armor. Well, if you have to know, the data signatures are forged as relic armor metadata, the kind that Journey was set to ignore. There's lots of outdated info in this software. Do you really need to know the soil density and mineral composition of the surrounding bricks? Or the local alpha meter readings? Or maybe you'd like to know their potential value in dollars and cost assessment of the complex ore surrounding us. What the gods is $1? Windrunner asked a second before I got to doing the same. Why are you asking me? Cathida said. It's just a number on the system under the column value. Could be the keys to the goddess's kingdom for all we know and I'd miss it for pretty sparkle. Value's extremely vague and nobody's left anything else to work with. I'm not your golden saint with all the answers. We do not have the time for this. Kedra cut in. Focus, Keith. Right. We've got to deal with a backstabbing sneaky calculator first. Journey, can you highlight where the source of the signals are? Now that's a question it can work with. Cathida grumbled, complying. The HUD changed, outlines showing on all armors, isolating where the signals were on each of us. We found Kedra's first. Hidden under a fold of her dress, looking more like a small clump of dirt, magnetized to stick on the armor. Her relic armor hadn't noticed one loose signal from all the others being communicated between the group. This is too clean. Windrunner said, finding his own bug slipped between armor plates. He didn't find just one either, there were 3 in there, 2 dormant while the third did the work. This is specialized tech. How did he come up with something like this in a few hours? He didn't, I said, recognizing the simplicity of the design as Journey's scanning brought out reports on the dirt we'd found. This sort of tech wasn't made last second. He'd need trial and error to figure out exactly what data he could send that relic armors would ignore. This wasn't made to handle us. This was made to handle any relic user he'd run into. Tracking where people are isn't something he came up with to deal with us, it's his default tactic. I took a closer look through the soul sight, now that I knew what I was looking for. Machinery inside came into focus, the concepts simple and clear. My regular eyes would have had a hard time focusing on the tiny things, but the soul sight was very different. Concepts didn't have different sizes after all. The little bugs looked like small pucks, with one side flat while the other had a randomized rock-like surface, making it look like a speck of dirt. And the flat surface was strongly magnetic. Everything else inside the tiny robot was made to help transmit the signal. The only thing it used to hide was its size and keeping the signal hidden among the junk. Tuovilis must have spent some time designing this and using it against other relic armors in the past. Which made him the first feather I knew about to use things like this. Wrath, I called out. Do feathers normally use tools like this? No. She sent back immediately. Although I only have surface understanding of other feathers. There may be more that deviate from standards. Windrunner cursed under his breath. When did he get this stuff on us? The tunnels. Kedra said. Consider it. We all have more than a single transmitter around on our armor, they're clearly mass-made. Tuovilis could have put hundreds scattered across a few different choke points. How did he know we'd even use the tunnels? Windrunner countered. That's one giant leap. If we didn't have K, he stopped, then turned to look at me. Before you kept to yourself how you knew about the tunnels, was that information deliberately leaked to you? Is your source planted? Did Abraxas set me up? That coward of a machine kept watching over Tarath and I for days on end. Why turn traitor on us now? Not to mention I had to force it out of him. No. Can't see any reason why my source would be a setup. I think he took a lucky gamble. I said, he didn't know if we'd use the tunnels or not, but he set up everything so that we'd be forced to. Putting suffocate at the center point forced us to consider alternative options, like a surround. And in doing so, we'd either run into the tunnels ourselves while setting up, or we'd run into something he'd planned to draw us into the tunnels one way or another. Windrunner looked up, muttering. All gone to hell faster than any other expedition I'd been on. It's fine, we're still alive and we have time to make a plan. I raised a hand. I've got a suggestion for the bugs. I say we reuse, and recycle. 4 spiders stalked forward, slowing down in confusion. Their targets had gone silent, no more sounds of sprinting footsteps on water. Maybe they thought we'd stop to talk again, and so they all scurried around to take a position. And then a wide-range ping was sent out, the same scan as before. The spiders knew we'd spotted them once already, so they were again prepared to fend off. 2 knights leaped straight up, landing on the ruined wall, right into sight. Staring down at the spiders. Both knights lifted grenade launchers and aimed. The spiders did what spiders do, shields flaring into life on their arms, lifting them up to protect their main body from whatever it was those humans were about to fire down with. Their shields could handle any kind of human weapon. Unfortunately for the spiders, night breakers were on a different level. Both rounds launched, expanded, and ripped into the stationary machines, shields and all. I couldn't have asked for better targets. The remaining 2 knew they were in trouble. They booked it, only to be pincered in by one more knight in teal colors, a blade twirling out. Behind the 2 spiders, were the 2 knights in red who'd opened fire on them, namely Kedra and I, already jumping down to tackle these leftovers. And ahead of them was the lone teal knight with only 1 sword out. They picked to take their chances against Windrunner. 1 knight was a better bet than 2. And I'm sure they had some sensors that let them notice Windrunner was filled with broken bones and muscle contusions. Surely he couldn't pose that much of a threat to them, they must have thought. Works for us. Instead of chasing after the fleeing targets, Kedra and I went to recover our spent Nightbreaker shells. Those had been engineered to be reusable. We just needed to wiggle them out of the dead spiders. I have no idea what the 2 spiders would be thinking of this time, watching the humans fishing around the cut-up guts of their pack mates as they ran off in the other direction. If I had to bet, I'd say they were rapidly more occupied about a specific knight in the teal heraldry of House Windrunner, the very same night they thought could be shoved aside and left behind. The spiders ran right into him, like rats running directly into the open claws of a waiting cat. Windrunner blurred with unnatural speed, unhinged laughter spilling out of him as he slipped under the guard of the first spider, neatly stabbing his sword into a weak spot of some kind. The spider's lights went out, but not before Windrunner vaulted from under the belly. Using a hand to swing himself up, flipping halfway until his feet were on the upper shell. From there he kicked off like a rocket, directly as the other fleeing target, blade flashing out. The spider realized it wasn't going to escape, turned and swiped out for the gleeful knight. Windrunner twisted like a cat in midair, free hand grabbing hold of the swinging leg. The spider took a few hesitant steps backwards, waving the captured leg frantically, as if it were trying to flick a disgusting insect off its fingers. Windrunner let go. It just wasn't in the direction the spider had hoped for. Instead, he flew right at the spider's main body courtesy of the spider's own misguided attempts to knock him away. His feet skidded on top of the smooth surface, a blade plunging down into the shell at the same time, leaving a blue trail behind. The spider screeched in panic. It instantly retracted all legs, flopping onto the floor with a thud, while 6 reversed arms all stabbed out wildly above itself, trying to knock the knight dancing around on top. He dodged 3 in quick succession, slipped under the guard of a 4th, vaulted over a 5th, and chopped a path through the 6th, ending with him sliding down the domed shell of the spider, blade flashing down for the front. His boots hit the ground, his helmet glared up, waiting. The spider shrieked against the damage, scrambling up and away, every leg it had digging at the stone ground to push itself further away. Which was exactly what Windrunner had been waiting on. An easy exposed target on the belly. He threw his blade like an arrow, where it sank directly on target. The spider's lights flashed out, its momentum causing it to roll over on its back, legs frozen in their final movements. That was cathartic, he said with a satisfied sigh, slapping his hands free of non-existent dirt, walking over for the hilt of his discarded sword. Feels good to move as fast as they do now. Even the score out. Now, on to the next part of your plan, kid. Right. I said, catching up. Journey, toggle on the countermeasures. Done. Cathita said. And? Looks like it worked out exactly as theory said it would. Gold for gold, dearie. I'd spent a few years of my life trying to get internet working on the surface, or at least a prototype version of it. Signals and comms were part of the technology I was looking into, trying to find a way to create a net of broadcasting buoys. That plan was doomed for failure, of course, but the knowledge didn't go to wastes. Signals were ultimately waves when all the math was boiled down. And waves could be nullified with an equal and opposite wave. We knew what the transmitters were sending off. So I had Journey and the other armors study the patterns, and set up an exact counter pattern to transmit. I could have gone through and squashed all of these into actual dust, but I had plans for these little critters. Almost predictably, he gave us a call the moment he realized he no longer had any eyes on us. Continue to resist, and I will hunt down your separated brethren and eliminate them. Tuovilus said over the general comms channel. I have the skill to do so. Even if I can't track you, I can track them. You didn't show your face with Tuorda, and you didn't come to help to Sefit. I'm starting to think you're not here at all, are you? I said. You know what all this adds up to? A bluff. Then you gamble with lives that aren't yours. Does that sit right with you, human? Windrunner shook his head. Have to hand it to him, he really pulls out every dirty trick in the book. Moment he starts losing, he's already going for the backup options. Tuovilus, can I call you Tuovilus? Tuovilus is a mouthful, you know. I said. Call me what you want, Winterscar. I only care to recover Tarath, alive or dead. You're a curiosity but not my objective. Get a feeling I'm about to be upgraded from curiosity to nuisance. Now I'm going to hang up, because I'm quite sure you're trying to keep me talking as a last desperate attempt to keep track of our general location while you scramble out some kind of response. See you soon, buddy. And Wrath says hi. I shut off the comms, ignoring whatever message he'd sent back. Likely one trying to goad me into talking scrap shit with him some more. Wrath, ever the patient saint, decided not to let me know I wasn't being honest with Tuovilus about her warm regards. She stayed in the sack, waiting with Zagreus and Atius nice and safe while we were squashing the spiders. You okay with us fighting off spiders? Not that we have much of a choice. I said, lifting up the sack and hooking it on my back. I feel sorrow that they had to be eliminated, she said. However, I understand reality. A commander needs to be prepared to lose their own units, and these are enemies. So long as they don't come back as feathers looking to smite me, I'll take whatever kills I can get. Windrunner grumbled, reaching Atius and lifting him carefully onto his back. He was hacking out black blood a lot less, wheezing instead. His lungs must be clearing up. Hopefully that deathless constitution of his would get him back on his feet soon. He was a large part of our team's damage and utility. Kedra wordlessly took hold of Sagrius and followed procedure. On his front, Sagrius hadn't improved, still comatose, and the armor was still in command of his body. It hadn't talked much at all, other than answer basic questions. Incredibly eerie. Father was doing his best with the other knights under his command, we had to trust he'd figure it out. As for the rest of us, we had our own show to handle. Journey, open up the map and give us directions, I ordered. The armor complied, a green arrow and highlighted line showed up superimposed on my HUD. Despite Kedra telling me it wasn't the time to ask Journey a bunch of questions, we still had to map out more of the area before we could find a good ambush spot for the spiders. During that time, I found out a few more things about all these disabled and abandoned settings that were still running due to hardware rather than software. Relic armor had excellent sensors embedded into the helmets, capable of full-spectrum composition analysis in micro situations, and it had wide-spectrum analysis with less detail for the macro situations. No idea why random features like this ended up in the armor, this was just one of many niche features the armors ended up with. I could imagine a few Reacher all working together and slipping in different things they thought could be useful. And when field testing came around, the Reachers would opt to turn off and mothball the extra features as it was easier than removing all of the junk directly. Not like a few extra pounds would make any difference to a relic armor. The wide-range scanners were passive and helped out mapping the surroundings as we'd run through it. They did more than map, they were running analysis on the wall composition, alluvium levels left by all the water, and all kinds of other random data points that had next to no worth in the battlefield. But there was one bit of data that I found interesting. The scanner portions that let relic armors figure out exactly how deep the knights had been buried when Tuorda showed up and ripped the tunnel apart. That could tell density of land, and pockets of air further past the rock. How's that useful in combat? Generally it's not. But in this particular case, we know there was a basement level under us somewhere that was accessible through the center of the temple, where the Might Forge was located. So I'd asked Journey to narrow down the place where the floor is structurally thin enough to get through with some creative finagling. We'd make our own stairwell down a level, and leave him looking around for us in the wrong area. If Tuovilis was going to play this out like a rat bastard, he'll quickly learn he's not alone. Book 4, Chapter 30, Interlude, Clan Knights. Lorei Isastride moved with every bit of speed she could push her ancient armor to go. The rest of the team did just the same, sprinting through the tunnels. They held the speed, oftentimes jumping and running against walls in order to take shaper turns, trying to outrun what was stalking behind their group. They'd barely managed to pull out the trapped knights that Feather with the great shield had separated. Things were difficult, but they'd made progress. Now, 2 of them were dead. Seraphine of House Tempest held onto the helmets, each containing the souls of those knights. There wasn't time to salvage the full relic armors, or what was left behind of them, the helmets would do for now. They could recreate new armors from those. As for the souls, Lorei wasn't sure. The Winterscar scion would figure something out. His own father was one such soul. She had to hold out to hope. Lord Atius had taken him under his personal tutelage, and the clan lord was someone all of them trusted implicitly. More of them were wounded, and that was far more understandable and real to her mind. Javelin Storm Sweeper had most of his ribcage shattered, only the soul fractal kept him active and moving, and he wasn't alone. The other Storm Sweeper showed critical health, a punctured lung, and heavy internal bleeding where bone shards had done the true damage. His armor gave him 2 days to live without medical attention. If they both perished here, their house would have lost all their relics in one mission. Others had more minor issues, anywhere from a broken leg or muscle contusions, depending on how far away from each blast they'd managed to get. Ahead of the team, the Winterscar Knights led the charge forward, Nightbreakers carefully held in one hand, like the rest of the knights. All of them new knights who'd barely had any training in relic armor, rookies at best to the field. Few had actual training in an armor, the rest were simple soldiers who'd never been able to climb the ranks high enough. Until this month, none had even gone underground yet. What horrible luck! Pit against an enemy most clan knights wouldn't see in their lifetime. A harsh first mission for those new knights. She didn't know what she could do to protect them. As it was, Lorei was having a hard time keeping herself alive. She knew some of the other knights here resented House Winterscar, their own houses took years to gain even one relic armor, shared by dozens of their best warriors. And Winterscars were suddenly wealthy enough to have 7 armors among their group, each dedicated to only one warrior. The Lady Winterscar and the young Master Winterscar she could understand. The other 5? Rookies all in one. Worse, they were clearly compromised in some manner that deeply disturbed the rest of the veterans here. It wasn't clear if the Winterscar loyalty remained with the clan, or with their young master. The clan knights could forgive and overlook quite a lot of crimes, possible treason however was something that she couldn't overlook so simply. A part of her hated herself for even understanding and empathizing why the Winterscars may have put their master on a pedestal higher than the clan lord. She shook the thoughts from her head. There was no time for politics on a mission. As much as the knights disliked the Winterscars, against a common enemy, surface clans always banded together even in the middle of a blood feud. It was tradition, and great dishonor came to any who held on to personal gripes when faced with a dangerous enemy. And the enemy behind them was far more dangerous than anything any clan had to fight. Loyalty and treason were ultimately judgments for the clan lord alone. The clan knights would serve and leave the decisions to him. And of all missions she'd taken part of, this one felt particularly important not just to the clan but all humanity. Enough so that even the clan lord himself would hedge his own home against the success. She'd work with the Winterscars as if they were her own brothers and sisters, and let them be judged once the snow had settled. The occult pulsed around them again in the subtle telltale sign of their hunter. This time it sounded right behind her. She ignored the chill spreading down her back, diving further into the soul fractal to escape her body's fear. Her armor crouched mid-sprint, letting the boot slide against the ground with a few sparks, twisting herself around gracefully, one hand aiming the Nightbreaker while the other held a blade at the ready. Rear flank! She called out, alerting the rest of the team. Armors had shown difficulty measuring or detecting the occult, they lacked the hardware and software to do so, despite being made of the occult themselves. Teamwork was needed as the enemy had already preyed on this blind spot before. She was going to open fire with the Nightbreaker this time instead of holding onto it in reserve. The feather hunting them all had shown himself immune to threats, unlike Tuakar who'd been forced to engage more cautiously so long as a weapon was trained on him. Pale blue light came from the rock wall, and a pale blue figure stepped through, similar to the wraiths the Winterscar scion had summoned before. In his hands, a ghostly chain spun around, already gathering speed. The figure materialized, turning solid again, and dragging the dangerous weapon into reality with him. She didn't have time to soak in the details, as the chain whip was speeding directly at her with the mace head tip. Her number was up. She pressed down on the trigger the moment he was material enough. An instant after, she threw herself to the side, slamming her shoulder into a rough dodge roll. A cold pulsed across the tip of the chain weapon as it sailed by her, just as she recovered from her roll. The shockwave leaping out from the weapon was caught by her armor's shields, strong enough to throw her into the wall. It jolted her neck and head violently to the side. She could see bits of her organs shake through the soul sight, but the hit hadn't been direct. The shockwave was minor, force transferring through the air and rapidly losing the dangerous edge. Her neck would feel sore once all of this was over, but so would most of her body given the hits she'd already taken on this mission. Lorei was still alive and capable of combat. That was a victory in itself. Her own shot had been fired with expert aim and flew right into the figure. Then the round went through the figure, slamming against the wall behind him. She hissed a curse under her breath. The feather had gone immaterial right as the shell was about to collide against him. A moment later, he was corporal again, withdrawing the chain in midair, the movements defying gravity and all logic as the chain returned back into a swinging circle in his hands. A twist around himself and the chain again raced out, seeking for another victim in a straight line forward. Directly at Javelin this time, the clan knight rushing forward to intercept alongside the 2 others holding the rear guard. They'd passed by Lorei a moment ago, becoming the largest threat to the feather now. The knight jumped to the side of the attack, only for the feather's hand to grip the occult chain at the base. The section touched instantly winked out of power, allowing the enemy to manipulate the weapon with ease. The chain's mace end redirected from the tug at the base of the hilt, and slammed into Javelin's exposed side. The occult pulse came out again, and Javelin was tossed far into the wall, shields flaring up as chunks of rock cracked and flew off from the destruction. His medical report turned from orange to red as he bounced off the rock and down into the ground. Too much internal bleeding inside, too many fragmented bones cutting away at the man's soft tissues. Despite the damage, he was already standing back up on one knee as quickly as he could. The chain was recalled, and then swung back, like a white occult scythe, seeking him out again from a side angle, relentless. Javelin drew out his blade, angling it like a shield against the bright blue chain links of the feather's weapon. His edge held against the chain as it crashed into him. And then the mace tip continued its path, wrapping around the knight's side, arm, back and helmet neck guard. Shields flared up, trying to protect their user in one last desperate attempt, but Lorei had seen this happen twice already. Just like night breakers, this feather's weapon also ate away shields faster than an eye blink. Javelin didn't have time to utter a gasp of surprise. His shields flared and broke. Fractals on his armor lit up, the occult dome shields holding off the chain. Willpower pitted against the very concept of destruction. Javelin held off the chain long enough for him to yank his reserve knife out of his boot and launch it against the feather with one last war cry. The enemy's spare hand backhanded the thrown weapon, taking a slight dip in his shield in the exchange. One of the few times any damage had been successfully dealt. Almost at the same moment, the chains broke past Javelin's occult defense and ripped into his arm, chest, and neck, cutting through the armor as if it didn't exist. Lorei's HUD showed his name turn grey. He'd been one of the better trained knights with those fractals. Far better at it than she was. Now, all that was left of the knight was cut sections of armor, and far too much blood. Another one of them dead. A veteran, a dozen years of history and close calls, hundreds of expeditions where he'd returned successful and alive, all to end up here. Killed in a blink of an eye. The other two knights continued their wild sprint forward, ignoring the grim sight, eyes focused only on the enemy. Nearly there. The feather withdrew his chain again, the hilt he carried outright eating the links back into itself, far too much mass for it to hide. There had to be some kind of space-folding fractal within that hilt hiding the true length of the weapon. His armored foot stepped back, and flicked her spent Nightbreaker round up and into his spare hand. The feather nodded, then turned translucent again, walking backwards into the wall, melting into it, as the two clan knights ripped into the earth and rock with their blades, failing to catch the thief. They cursed loudly, one slamming an arm against the rock in impotent fury. Mark a third round stolen. Isostride Prime called out. Note that the enemy is attempting to bait our attacks in order to secure the rounds. We'll need to open fire on him when he has no choice but to remain manifested. All units, hold fire on Nightbreakers until further notice or if you are completely sure it will connect. The feather had begun his reign of terror with thievery 20 minutes ago. Appearing behind the team with no weapons and 2 free hands. With those, he'd unhooked 2 Nightbreakers, launchers and all, from the backs of 2 knights before turning immaterial again and slipping away with his haul. They'd been forced to hold onto their weapons with one hand now, just to be sure the weapons couldn't be stolen again. The feather had tried again, and thus far hadn't been able to steal more rounds. Now he had 3 rounds to his name. All because Lorei hadn't been fast enough on the trigger. If she could have had that round slam into the scrap head the moment he'd attempt his chain occult trick, it might have worked. She should have fired earlier, before he'd materialized. We can't outrun him. Their leader said, thinking. Form up into a defensive ball, eye swing, eyes on the ceiling. Tempest Knights, eyes on the floor. Everyone else, cover your angle. We'll escape this slowly. Eyes out for possible explosives or structurally weak ceilings. A cave-in is likely his next plan. The knight was an experienced veteran of her house, and the 3rd highest ranking knight, with Windrunner and Clan Lord Atius taking the higher ranks. He was growing on the years, white hair and heavy wrinkles claiming his head, while his bones barely supported his movements anymore. In armor, the man was among their most deadly knights. Not just for his skill with the blade, but also his uncanny ability to ferret out machine and raider movements ahead of time. She'd been on expedition with him as a lead more than a dozen times over her career. Windrunner was more politically powerful, and a better swordsman, but in terms of tactics, she'd trusted the Isostride Prime. Though perhaps she was being biased, considering he was part of her house. Their group moved at a far more comfortable pace now, all in lockstep with one another. A cult pulsed once more, and this time the Tempest Knights called out on comms the direction. A blue wraith's head lifted from underground, eyes watching. Realizing he'd been spotted from all the weapons pointing directly at his face, he vanished back underground, aborting the attack. The next attack had been within the minute, where he had appeared already ahead of the team, past a turn they'd been approaching. The moment the Winterscar Knights checked their angle, a chain was already soaring to the front one. He moved on sheer reflex, turning his torso and taking a small step to the side, letting the chain soar past his helmet, trusting the warriors behind him to handle the attack. Behind, a House Tempest Knight had a blade slashing up, slapping against the chain tip and throwing the mace end up and into the wall. The occult detonation hit a moment later, ripping chunks of rocks down, revealing rays of artificial light above. Water poured in from the hole, dropping down like a waterfall into the tunnels, swiftly building up at their feet before sweeping down the path. The ceilings were thin here. They must be close to the temple entrance, just under the lake of shallow water that surrounded the temple. The Winterscar Knights charged forward at the monster before them, moving as a team in a perfect example of a flying V formation. Rookie soldiers with little experience they may be, they were still clan sword masters who'd been trained with aspirations to become relic knights. They all knew how to fight both individually and as a team. The feather twirled the chain back and once more went for a scything attack. Low enough to the ground, all four knights leapt above it without pause. The feather hummed, eyes narrowing through those spectacles of his. A pale white armored gauntlet once more reached to the base of the chain, pushing it with the back of his hand, and pulled the chain like a knight fishing against a reel. The chain obeyed his command, striking the wall, bouncing off and redirecting back at an angle. She knew what would happen next. At this angle, the knights would be forced to crouch under. And right as they did, the feather would use that hand already on the chain, moving his body in sync, and force the chain down on the crouching knight like an executioner's blade. One more of them would die again. The Winterscar Knight closest did just that, crouching to avoid the attack, blade lifted with one hand, ready in guard for an attack that would only wrap around his defense and end him in one blow. The feather followed through, a step back, twisting his torso and chest all the while manipulating the chain. A burst of occult spread through it, halting its prior speed, hanging still in the air for only a moment before it soared down to wrap around the caught knight. His blade struck out, connected with the occult chain, and then he pushed further. Using the occult edge on his blade like a makeshift hand, forcing the chain to the side as he twisted out of the way. A deflection and dodge in one fluid motion. The result was brilliant. The chain crashed against the ground, harmless again. The feather recalled the chain, or attempted to. Another Winterscar stomped down hard on the mace end of the chain, blade flying down to stab the weapon through one of the links and pin it to the ground before it could slither away back to its master. He succeeded, the tip of his sword digging perfectly through one of the open links, and then sinking further into the rock. The feather's strength was simply too much for his armor or the rock under him to hold against. The chain flew back to the owner's hilt as if nothing had tried to hold it back in the first place, while the Winterscar's blade ripped out of his hand, the rocks under him breaking apart with little resistance, destabilizing his footing. The enemy observed the tunnel cautiously, a hand on the hilt of his spare longsword, as the other two Winterscar knights neared within striking distance. She could tell he was contemplating his odds, weighing how much time he had before the rest of the night and herself descended on him. The Winterscars slashed for his throat and arms, both blades going through the transparent wraith. He rematerialized, the blade in one hand, the shortened chain in the other. Using the blade as a spare hand to move his chain, all the while stabbing and striking out against the two knights with incredible speed. Each time they came close to a hit, he turned immaterial, allowing the blow to pass by for a split second. But in doing so, he was giving up his own chance of dealing damage alongside, the immaterial chain sailing through a Winterscar's chest plate in one such clash. Attempts to deal damage to the Winterscar knights only opened him up for counterattacks, and while he moved far faster than either of the knights, there were two of them and both were looking for a chance to shoot him with the Nightbreakers at point-blank range. It was controlled chaos, slashes and stabs flying wildly, all of it parried, blocked, dodged or aborted midway to avoid danger as he took steps backwards. The feather fought against the pair with a cold calculating glare, contemplating each movement, each attack, each swing of his chain, seeking out weaknesses. She saw the change in his objective the moment it happened. He stopped going for hits on the knights to whittle down their shields, and turned his attention to breaking apart those Nightbreaker launchers. He managed one, cutting it near the hilt of the soldier's grip. The barrel flew free, and within it, the round itself remained. He wasn't able to kick it away into his territory, the Winterscar knight too quick to spike the flying part down with the flat of his blade the moment it had been cut off, while the other instantly kicked the down scrap backwards, into the rest of the clan knight formation and safe from the feather's attempt to steal the weapon. For once, the feather looked annoyed at that. The first sign of true emotion on the creature. The rest of the clan knights descended on the enemy a moment later. He chose to retreat back into the wall. 2 was his limit. Fighting the knights in close quarters had been the most danger he'd let himself be in thus far. Once more the knights hit against dull rock, leaving no trace of the enemy. Their group huddled back into a defensive circle, not letting the enemy possibly catch them off guard. Isastride Prime nodded at the 4 knights with their blood-red sigils. Calmly analyzing the battle, Old Eyes trying to discern every bit of information he could. He'd reached a conclusion. He won't reappear, he said to the quiet group. We've been adapting new methods of fighting him off with each encounter. Now, we've gone even with him for the first time. The next, we could score a victory. He will not take that chance. Once we make it out of the tunnels, we'll report all our findings to the clan lord, including what worked and didn't. The group took his word as law, forming up and continuing down the tunnel, to where the entrance of the temple might be. They had to get through these tunnels and warn Lord Atius of the threat. Even against a full battalion of trained knights, all using the Winter Blossom technique in addition to Night Breakers, 3 of them had died, more had been wounded and ordnance had been stolen right from their hands. It took another half-hour to navigate to another entrance, and Isastride Prime's prediction had come true. They found light at the end of the tunnel, and exited out into the open air of the temple ruins, safe and alive. Comms connection returned instantly, including with the shadow songs left behind the perimeter, and the away team further into the temple. The feather never reappeared since their last fight. She didn't know if she should be thankful, or worried. With every clash, they'd gained some information on how to fight him. Information that had come at the cost of their lives, but could save Lord Atius and the others alongside him. Regardless, they survived the gauntlet. And now they could take the fight to the enemy.